We're going to get started on the Plains Sustainability Commission April 8th, 2014 meeting. Today we have order of business, items of interest from the commissioners, consent agenda, and it's comprised of two items, consideration of meeting minutes from 311 and the 319 meetings, and a proposed street vacation of Southwest Moody north of Ross Island Bridge. Has everyone reviewed that and is okay leaving it on? And then we will have three briefings, recap 6, short-term rentals, future of transit, TriMet service enhancement plan initiatives, and the last one, Southwest Corridor Plan, will also be a briefing. We'll start with a call of order of items and items of interest from the commissioners and the director's report. Let's go with Mike. Go ahead.
Well, I don't know if it's an item of interest necessarily, but it was interesting to me. I was on the way here walking through the park blocks, and as every spring, those elm trees are full of pine siskins on their way through, and I sent each of you and Joe and Julie a little video clip. Listen carefully and you will hear the pine siskins. Be happy to share with anyone else. Thank you.
Thank you.
The rites of spring.
The rites of spring. Thank you. Chris?
Yes, I became aware of an issue that I think the commission may want to take some notice of. We've been briefed previously that there's a regional transportation plan update going on, but I learned in the past week or so that for the first time there will be a specific streetcar category in the regional transportation plan. And PBOT staff has been soliciting input on the projects and priority for projects to go into that. There are basically the RTP, there are kind of two buckets. There's the fiscally constrained plan, the things we think we actually have money for, then there's sort of the wish list for if we had a little more money, what would happen, and projects can be moved between those two buckets. So I reminded the PBOT staff who were doing this that the Portland plan actually has direction on this and suggests that within the first 5 years we should take 2 or 3 corridors into a corridor analysis project, and one of those should be outside the central city. And I think at the time we were thinking about Lentz, Gateway, St. John's. So I noted that there were no projects that didn't have at least one end in the central city in their list, and really there ought to be one. I've had a chance to meet a couple times now with PBOT staff. I think, Andre, you've talked with PBOT leadership, so you can probably confirm this, that the way Metro has set up the process, there's really not an opportunity to do the kind of analysis on a project that would say it, on the technocratic factors it merits inclusion. Their technocratic factors also don't have strong equity indicators. So in talking with PBOT staff who are actually working this, their strong preference would be to use the TSP as the opportunity to analyze this and prioritize this, and then submit a set of RTP amendments when the TSP is complete. I understand that from a staff process, it makes all the sense in the world. I am disappointed that we would have a document as significant as the RTP that wouldn't reflect some explicit equity goals that we put in the Portland plan. So I think we might want to at least tell Metro that we're disappointed by that, and hold our staff feet to the fire to actually make the work happen during the TSP and make sure we get the equity criteria in and have a chance to evaluate it in light of the Portland plan objectives around that. So I offer that. If there's interest in doing a letter.
And just a little bit more information on this. Chris did apprise me of this, and I kind of dug into it too. And it really is a process question of Metro not allowing kind of an equity lens to be viewed in the RTP process. So what we're looking for, and really our focus, I think, should be in the TSP process, which is the Portland PBOT process, that we can look for them to include equity as a lens and really follow the Portland plan as Chris has laid out. And with that, come back, we would see the TSP come before us, as I understand it, and then if there's a recalibration of, and they followed the plan, there's a recalibration of projects, then we could amend not the TSP, but the RTP after the TSP is adopted, and from that standpoint. So get back into it and get the Portland preferences put back into the RTP at a later date. So it would mean that we would put our focus really on the TSP PBOT process and ensuring that we see the equity component come through in there. But it also shows what I think is a problem that we have in kind of a global process of Metro, that we're trying to incorporate equity into our plan, our process and everything, but we have external partners that have not probably caught up with that
Not
process.
to the same depth anyway.
Yeah, and so I agree with Chris. We ought to point out that flaw and hope that they can kind of get caught up and improve their process a little bit, so that we're not, this is really, the RTP is kind of a way to look at funding. And it's a way of applying dollars, federal dollars, to prioritize projects that a local government has said that are a priority to it in the future. So we, because a project will be on the list that we may not agree with, it may attract dollars, and that's the way unintended consequences of things happen, that down the road, people ask, well, why didn't our neighborhood get something? And it's because 10 years, 15 years earlier, there was not that look, and now it's funding time and it's there. So I think this is a grand opportunity to point out a potential improvement. And also, PBOT understands that, from my communication, that there is, an opportunity in the TSP process to make some improvements and reevaluate.
An acronym-heavy
Okay,
discussion.
so TSP is Transportation Systems Plan.
Which is a component of the comprehensive
People
plan.
on cable.
Transportation Systems Plan, and that's part of the comprehensive plan. It really is laying out the transportation components of the city that underlie in terms of sidewalks, bikes, local streets and freight corridors and rail corridors. So it lays out that hierarchy and priorities for the city of Portland as part of the comp plan. And regional transportation plan is a metro process that, again, prioritizes that cities, Metro asks for the prioritization that prioritizes the regional, from the TSPs, the regional transportation system plan, if you will, of priorities for investment as they look for, dollars.
Hello. Money calling.
And so that's Metro,
Here's money. Here's money.
yeah, Metro.
I think that was helpful for folks.
Okay,
Right.
yeah. So those are the two kind of acronyms that we've been using. And PBOT is the Portland Bureau of Transportation.
Okay. So,
So I don't have much to say, but I just wanted to say that I do recall that we sat here with Metro giving a presentation on their equity lens, and that they have a new kind of a policy, and we asked questions about what that equity policy would be. Am I the only one remembering that, or I think I'm remembering that correctly? So this is a great opportunity to operationalize when we talk about equity, what we really mean. That's all I wanted to say.
if it's appropriate, Mr. Chair, I'll offer a motion that we write a letter to Metro expressing our disappointment that we're unable to reflect the Portland Plan equity objectives with respect to streetcar in this RTP, and expect that after we've completed our TSP, we'll be able to offer a set of RTP amendments to correct that.
Moved and second, all in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Approved. So I'll work with Chris and we'll get a letter around to everybody to send to Metro.
Nice.
Other items of interest? Don?
A quick update on the Southeast Quadrant. Thanks, Mike. The Southeast Quadrant Plan, I've been serving on the advisory committee. We've been meeting monthly this year, including a meeting last week. we're focused in right now on the southern triangle, which is the land south of Vamsey and includes 2 transit stations. And we're looking at land use alternatives, different scenarios for that. That conversation will continue in May, and then there'll be design charrettes in June that are scheduled to kind of address that whole program. I'd also note, speaking of PBOT, there's a subcommittee within our advisory committee that's looking at transportation issues and meeting with PDOT kind of as a sideline to make sure that there's a balanced approach to vehicular, pedestrian, bikes, and freight movement in the district, which is an issue we've heard loud and clear during our process. So it continues, and I'll update Planning Commission as we move along.
Great, thank you. Catherine?
That reminds me, I should probably give a West Quadrant Stakeholders Advisory Committee update. There's just so much to say. But so we have 3 meetings left, maybe 4. We were just kind of going over kind of how we're going to get this wrapped up. At this point, we have gone through all of the quadrants kind of within the west side and are pulling all the parts and pieces together and kind of, I think, now tackling some of the issues that continue to bubble up and maybe haven't been quite resolved. And so we're looking to kind of build consensus on what the recommendations should be in these next few meetings. Just as kind of a heads up, because I'm sure we'll be hearing more about it with this group. I think that we're going to find some more discussion on building heights within the west end of Portland, and we'll hear a fair amount of probably testimony at that when it comes to commission. There's also some discussion that's kind of been ongoing about how to motivate development in the parking block, on the surface parking lots in the Skidmore district. I would challenge everybody to think bigger than just Skidmore and just citywide, but that seems to be more of the focus of that particular discussion. There's a few other issues. Those are the 2 that kind of seem like they keep really kind of rising to the top as the ones we need to work through to build consensus to bring to this group.
Catherine, is the building height discussion of the West End focused on view obstruction?
So far, I haven't heard as much about view obstruction as of livability for those in high rises. You can correct me if I'm wrong, Joe, but I don't know that I've actually heard view obstruction even come up.
Well, then forget I said it. That's good.
You want to complicate it for us?
No,
Not us. No.
quite the opposite.
Yeah.
I think it's a broader discussion about building heights, and I think there just happens to be consensus within that quadrant about those tend to be buildings that aren't as high right now, and perhaps lots that some may see as more developable in the near future, and therefore, what do we want the neighborhood to look like moving forward?
Great.
Just a question on the parking lots. You had said it's primarily just for the west side, but is there, or has there been conversation, to your comment, about a broader definition of west side or I guess downtown?
Well, since our group is just downtown, we're just been focused on the west quadrant. That being said, the parking lot issue seems to be more focused in this kind of Skidmore Old Town neighborhood and really trying to get that area kind of pushing development forward there than other surface parking lots within the rest of downtown. But we'll see where the conversation goes in the next few meetings.
Okay.
I hope it does, I hope it does extend. I know the focus and the energy is in Skidmore, and I think there's some logical reasons for it, but it's a bigger issue, and hope maybe at the west end, people could study that a little.
Okay. Thank you. Other comments, questions?
I just wanted
Yes.
to make one comment, which is that for the first time ever, the city council and the mayor had a water and sewer rates meeting for the public. And we had it at Park Rose High School Theater, and the council sat on the stage and really did a great job of listening to people. They really didn't say very much. They had their staff do a presentation, and then it wasn't jam-packed with people, but there were people that showed up. And interesting thing, when they asked people to say where they were from, most of them were from the West. So I'm not really sure what that was about. But anywho, they did have it in the East, and that was good. And I had a chance to testify on behalf of East Portland Action Plan.
Joe?
Just 4 items today. First, BPF staff has interviewed 6 candidates for the youth position on the Planning and Sustainability Commission. There were 2 top candidates, and we forwarded those names on to Susan and to the mayor's office, who will interview those 2 in the next couple of weeks or so. Also, we have about a dozen candidates for the open seat on the PSC. And we're starting to review those, and we're hoping to move both together to City Council for appointment in May.
What are you looking for, Joe, on those 12?
Oh,
How do you counterbalance us?
it's difficult. It's difficult. I think we wrote this one to be focused on.
He's not going to answer that.
He's not. Careful, Joe.
I'll follow up with you on that.
Let's do that offline.
Yeah. Steely focus. Audit, number 2, Audit Services, the city's audit bureau, will release its report on the Bureau Planning and Sustainability's organics programs, which means yard debris and food scrap collection, so solid waste programs, at the end of this week or early next week. And it recommends that BPS work on increasing food waste collection by businesses and multifamily residents, and also continue to work on waste prevention. So when it comes out, you'll see those 2 recommendations. And the good news on that is both of those are consistent with the program directions that we're already going on now that we've got the residential composting program set up. Third, and this one's a recruitment for some volunteers. The Housing Bureau has another round of mixed-use limited tax exemption applications to submit to their investment committee. And it's in a couple of weeks that will start. In the past, Karen and Don were the PSC representatives for that work. So the Housing Bureau is asking for 1 or 2 PSC members to join that committee this year. The time commitment is limited to a couple of times a year and includes reviewing project write-ups of about 4 or 5 pages. This round, there was just 1 project, is what as my notes say. There could be multiple in future rounds. And to attend, after that review, the responsibility is to attend the investment committee meeting and provide feedback. The meetings are always on Thursday morning at 9:30 a.m. at the Housing Bureau. The upcoming meeting is scheduled for April 17th and will last about 30 minutes, and then the next meeting will be in August. If there are any of you who are interested in serving on this investment committee to review these limited tax exemption applications, please let Julie know, and we'll get you hooked up with the meeting schedule and the materials.
Yeah, I would like to interject something. I'm glad Commissioner Gray brought the water and sewer initiative up. Just a point of information, the judge who ruled on the lawsuit against the city concluded that the Bureau of Environmental Services expenditures on green infrastructures, street trees, acquisition of Riverview Cemetery and so forth were totally within the mission of the Bureau of Environmental Services. And I think it's important for people to understand that, because that initiative, of course, goes right after those programs. So it's something that's really important for folks to educate themselves on, because it's a very complicated issue.
And then I have one more item today that presents a transition to our first regularly scheduled item, which is today for recap 6. You're going to get a briefing, and it's specifically focusing on the short-term rental proposal that's in that package. We'll be having a hearing. Today's just a briefing, a hearing on April 22nd. We're going to meet with leadership at their next meeting in preparation for that hearing, and you will be receiving a package of the testimony that we've received so far in recap prior to the 22nd. I believe we're going to try to send it out at the end of the week. And so far, almost all, in fact, all the testimony received is on the short-term rental proposal, and not the rest of recap.
Okay, great. Any other comments? Great. Consent agenda. Do I hear a motion?
Yes, I move approval of the consent agenda. I do. I mean it. Or no,
So did you make a motion?
I did.
Oh, okay.
Howard, now, did you move to approve the two items on the consent agenda?
I
Did
did.
approve? Okay.
I'll second.
Second, it's been moved and seconded. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? No. Passes.
Successful.
Successful. Recap 6, short-term rentals. Sandra Wood, Julia Gleiser. I always get that wrong. I'm sorry. Gleiser.
Thank you,
Sandra.
Commissioners. I am Sandra Wood from the Bureau of Bureau of Planning and Sustainability. Second time I did this.
Integration.
Working very closely with my colleagues at Bureau of Development Services. We have a couple of them here today. Mike Liefeld is the Code Compliance Manager and has been integral to this project. Kristen Cooper is also with us today. And Julia Giesler from BPS has been our staff project planner on this. And we've invited Terry Williams to join us today too because she works for the Revenue Bureau and she can answer questions and describe for you what the transit lodging tax program for the city is. When we decided to come to the commission for this briefing, we were thinking we had learned so much during this process, so we just wanted to share and spend an hour with you and share what we've learned and certainly what our proposal is. Let you have a chance to ask questions, and then you have a couple weeks to consider the testimony that will be coming in and has been coming in, and that you'll hear on the 22nd. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started. So today's agenda is Julia will share some background on the types of short-term rentals and our current regulations, what other cities are doing, because I think a lot of people are curious about that, and what we heard about the proposal we published in January. We've changed our proposal and I'm bringing you our new proposal. I will go over what our proposal is, but in short, it's really to allow residents to rent 1 or 2 bedrooms out of their homes to overnight guests through a simple and streamlined permit process. So 1 or 2 bedrooms out of their homes to overnight guests through a simple and streamlined permit process. We have a lot to cover today, so I'm hoping that we can run through our presentation and give all 3 of us a chance to say what we need to say, and then we can come back for questions at the end if you don't mind. And with that,
Right.
pass it on to Julia.
Okay, so I just wanted to begin by being sure we were all clear on what rentals, the different types of rentals. There's long-term rentals, which are more than 30 days. So when you rent something on more than a monthly basis, like an apartment, a house, you get a roommate, it's more than 30 days. So that would be long-term. And then short-term rentals, which we'll be discussing today, are less than 30 days. And this project is not addressing long-term rentals, we're just addressing short-term rentals. So a couple of examples of short-term rentals, a couple examples of motels and hotels. They're commercial uses, they're not allowed in residential zones. They have annual health inspections and they pay transit lodging taxes. Bed and breakfasts are also short-term rentals. They're allowed through a conditional use review process in residential zones. They also have annual health inspections for facilities that have more than 2 guest rooms, and they also pay transit lodging taxes. So just briefly about the conditional use that process, it would be, most of them it would be a type 2. It's an administrative decision. It's appealable to the hearing officer. It takes between 8 to 10 weeks to process, and the fee is a little over $4,000. There's public notice that's sent to the property owners and recognized organizations within 150 feet. And since 2004, there's been 24 conditional use reviews for bed and breakfast facilities. So beyond these more traditional options for short-term rentals, there's this emerging trend. It's called there's called several things, but we're calling it peer-to-peer rentals. And it's where internet sites make it possible to connect people who want to rent their space with people who are looking for a place to stay. And the majority of these listings are in houses or in portions of houses where the operator, or sometimes called the host, lives on site as their primary residence. Currently, the zoning code allows these short-term rentals in residential zones as bed and breakfast through the conditional use process that I just described. Here are some logos for internet sites that facilitate peer-to-peer these peer-to-peer residential transactions in Portland. You may be familiar with some of them. Wanted to talk a little bit about the growth of these listings. This chart illustrates the increase of numbers of listings we see in Portland. The first line is Airbnb listings. The Airbnb is the largest internet serving Portland, and over the last 3 years, it's really grown very fast. Back in January of 2011, there was only 107 listings, and currently today there's over 1,500. And Airbnb focuses on renting a room in your house. It's that sharing your house. The VRBO, vacation rental by owner, or is the second line. It's also home away. You can see that there's much less activity of the vacation rentals than vacation rentals. We'll leave it at that. So the types of listings, the majority of listings are in houses. It's also popular to have these peer-to-peer rentals in accessory dwelling units, either in the upstairs or in the basement, or as this slide shows, as in an accessory dwelling unit. There's also some, not as popular, but some rentals in condominiums, and mostly for us in Portland and Waterfront and the Pearl, and then apartments in our along our main streets in commercial areas. So back to this slide, if you look at now we'll go down to short-term rentals. We are not in this project talking about hotels and motels. We're talking about short-term rentals that are either accessory to household living, such as a bed and breakfast, or the vacation rentals. So some of the things that we've learned from other cities, this is something that's happening all over the world, basically, and so lots of cities are grappling with how to regulate them. And we were curious to see what they're doing, just so we can apply it to our work. The first slide is bigger cities. You might have New York and San Francisco have basically banned short-term rentals at this point. You might have heard there's a lot of discussion in the newspaper lately. The issues are pretty complex. They revolve around maintaining housing in a market which is extremely high demand for both residents and visitors. And most of their units are in multi-dwelling buildings, often with rent control. So it's not a great comparison for us, but it's certainly interesting to be following. This is Cannon Beach. We looked at resort towns where they have a long history of regulating vacation rentals or short-term rentals. In Cannon Beach, there's an unlimited number of properties in Cannon Beach can rent a house or a portion of a house for up to 2 times a month. And then in addition to that, there's this rental pool of 92 units that there's unrestricted renting. You can rent all the time. The permit you get for the unrestricted, the 92, is only good for 5 years. And then after that 5-year period is over, then you have to go back in a waiting list to be able to be in that pool. To be either of those require a permit, and they have inspections that are part of getting that permit. Let's see, Ashland, of course, home to our Shakespearean festival, so it's a visitor destination. A few years ago, Ashland prohibited short-term rentals in all of their single dwelling zones. And in large part, that was because the existing bed and breakfast and lodging were feeling that the peer-to-peer was undercutting them. And so there was a lot of support for the existing bed and breakfast. In your testimony, you'll hear about Austin, Texas. Austin is one of the first cities to establish the short-term regulations back in 2012. So they have a little track record. They basically, they started out with two types of permits. One was an owner-occupied permit where the operator had to have the rental as their primary residence. And the second was where it didn't have to be owner-occupied, and those were your vacation rentals. And with the vacation rentals, they put a cap on 3% per census tract, which is kind of an interesting way to do that. And then they've just recently come back, and in January, they've amended their ordinance to have a separate ordinance that deals with multi-dwelling structures, and they put a cap on the amount of a percentage of each structure can have in short-term rentals. And finally, Amsterdam. Amsterdam, I'm not comparing Portland to Amsterdam, but the Amsterdam City Council just recently created a new category of short-term rentals that they call private rentals, and it's very flexible, and it allows anyone to rent their home or a portion of their home for an unlimited time without a permit and without a inspection. You still have to pay the taxes, and they talk a lot about you have to that there's some avenues if your neighbors complain that it sounds like they're taking the complaints of neighbors seriously. But again, this is brand new, so we don't know how that's going to play out. And finally, I just wanted to talk about our public involvement up to this point. We produced a public discussion draft early part of January, and we had 7 weeks to review with the community and stakeholders. And on the slides, basically all the outreach that we did. What we heard was pretty much two camps. We heard general support, which basically had to do with people being happy that that there was a process that was less cumbersome than the CU for the smaller 1 and 2 bedroom for the smaller rentals. There also was talk about that it was great that it would allow efficient use of underutilized rooms, and it allowed flexibility similar to home occupations, provided income to be able to stay in homes, particularly in times of job and income insecurity. And it brings tourist dollars to the neighborhood businesses. So visitors aren't just staying downtown, they're being able to stay throughout the city. And that also provides an alternative form of lodging, which from a visitor standpoint, people like. We also heard some opposition, and most of the concerns were around the impact to neighborhood livability, things we hear a lot about: noise, traffic, parking, privacy, housing affordability. There was also, second bullet is increased activity in residential enclaves, which really the discussion was a lot like, we have bought into this single-family neighborhood, and we pretty much expect limited non-residential activities to occur in it, and this is just going a little bit too far. So we heard a lot of that, and we also heard that this was too big of an issue for a recap project. So with that, I will let Sandra talk about the actual proposal.
Great, thanks, Julia. So because this proposal has to do largely with residential zones, I thought it would be worthwhile refreshing our memories as to what the zoning code says and what our policy is about residential zones. And what it says is that residential zones are intended to preserve land for housing. You'll hear about that during our comprehensive plan update project too. And that the use regulations are intended to create, maintain, and promote residential neighborhoods. They allow for some non-residential uses, but not to the extent as to sacrifice the overall image and character of the residential neighborhood. So I want you to keep that in mind as we go through this. And along those lines, I wanted to share other non-residential uses allowed in residential zones. We're all familiar with schools, of course, most of them are zoned residential, and they're within our residential neighborhoods. Religious institutions are also allowed, and both of those are allowed through conditional use reviews. Bed and breakfast facilities, which is so pertinent to today's conversation, are allowed through conditional use reviews. And then we start getting into some non-residential uses that are allowed through less than a conditional use review. The first one is home occupations. A home occupation is either you're working in your house by yourself, that's one form. A different form is where you're allowed either one employee or up to 8 customers a day. So we took that notion and we're applying it to this project in the sense that we think it's the same level of impacts to the neighborhood, same amount of traffic, and those are allowed currently in for all residential units. Market gardens are allowed outright also. And interestingly, something that doesn't come up very much for the commission is family daycares. That's regulated by the state, and up to 16 children are allowed to be taken care of in family daycares throughout the city. So people can have that in their house also. So getting back to our handy dandy chart here, Julia talked about, we're not talking about long-term rentals, we're not talking about hotels and motels, what we're talking about in this proposal is short-term and how we want to regulate one versus another. That middle box that says accessory short-term rentals, that's what we're renaming this whole category of uses. Before we would have called them bed and breakfast facilities. So that's the first part of our proposal, is to rename them accessory short-term rental. We feel that it modernizes the language and it just creates a more generic term that's more accessible to people who are doing these new peer-to-peer like activities. The other provision that we're doing is just figuring out what to do about vacation rentals. Vacation rentals are the ones where nobody lives in the house. It's just a house that's being rented on a nightly basis to vacationers. And our proposal is to not allow those. So I'll be going through the specifics of that. So that the third big provision of our proposal is to differentiate the accessory short-term rentals. These are where this is your primary residence and you're renting out rooms in your house, or the operator is renting out rooms in their house. And we're distinguishing what we're calling a type A from a type B. The type A is 1 and 2 bedrooms, so the small one, and the type B is 3 to 5 bedroom. The vast majority of the bed and breakfasts that have been approved through the conditional use process, as you recall, Julia said there's been 24 since 2004, are the type B type. They're the bigger ones. So I would like to draw your attention to the purple sheet that was handed out, and they're available in the front for members of the public. Does everybody have that? There are basically 10 provisions included in our proposal, and I apologize for having to go through all 10 of them, but I don't know how else to go through what the proposal is, so I'll try to make it as speedy as possible. The left column talks about the type A, and that's the 1 and 2 bedroom. That's the one we're creating a new permit process for. The right column shows the type B, and that articulates the existing conditional use process that we are proposing to remain for the 3 to 5 bedrooms. So the regulations virtually will not change for the 3 to 5 bedrooms. So you can take a look at comparison, but I'll use a slideshow to walk us through each of the provisions. So there are 10 pieces to this puzzle and 10 things we had to take in consideration. The first one is that we're proposing to allow short-term rentals as accessory to residential uses. What this means is that the individual or family who operate the accessory short-term rental must occupy their unit as their primary residence. There are two kind of unspoken points that are being made by this slide and this regulation. The first is that this doesn't necessarily mean that the operator is on site at all times. The operator might be there, or they might be out to dinner, or they might be out of town. So that has been a point of discussion of whether we should require the operator or the host to be on site when the rooms are rented or not. So we are not proposing that the operator needs to be on site. Being an accessory use also means that we're not proposing to allow full vacation rentals. The primary reason for this is to preserve residential land for residential uses. So what the proposal is to allow residences as usual, as we've always had, and residences with short-term rentals. Hopefully that makes sense. The second provision I want to talk through is the
Sandra,
building.
question before you leave
Yeah.
that first one. Is the owner residency requirement already part of the prior bed and breakfast code?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Well, let me follow that. It's bed and breakfast. So if the owner's not there, who serves breakfast? I mean, is there is that just a title? In other words, it doesn't
just a-
necessarily infer that renting the room means you get food.
Exactly, and that's another reason why changing the name to accessory short-term rental
Okay.
is a good idea. The second provision is about building types. We're proposing to allow short-term rentals in houses, attached houses, duplexes, manufactured homes, and accessory dwelling units. The reason the list is lengthy is because in our zoning code, we have different residential structure types. These are some of the residential structure types. There's also multi-dwelling structures for triplex and above, for example, in our apartment building. We had originally proposed to allow these in apartments and condominiums also. And because we changed our proposal, I want to spend a little time discussing what our rationale was behind that change. And the rationale really stemmed from the building code, which was a new area for us planners to delve into. Because, of course, we approached this with, what zones would we want to allow this in? And what we learned about the building code is that building occupancy for 1 and 2 dwelling types, so meaning houses, attached houses, duplexes, they have one building code. And the building occupancy type is called a group R3 occupancy. When you have the R3 occupancy, there's a provision in the building code that allows for a lodging house, which allows you to rent up to 5 guest rooms without changing your occupancy to another occupancy type. So this proposal was in alignment with the occupancy type in the building code. What we also learned, though, if you imagine an apartment building doesn't have the R3 occupancy. It has an R2 occupancy because apartments are regulated under the commercial building code. So the R2 occupancy, if a tenant or a landlord wanted to convert one of those units into a sleeping unit for short-term tenancy, they would have to go through a change of occupancy permit to a different occupancy. It would change from an R2 to an R1 occupancy. And R1, we learned, is the same type of occupancy for a hotel. So you can imagine an apartment building, an apartment in an apartment building, switching to a unit like in the Residence Inn of Marriott or something. They basically have the same things in them, but the building code requires them to have different safety precautions and provisions. And what those provisions would be is that to change from an R2 to an R1 would require an architect's structural analysis, research and analysis, fire sprinklers, new doors and windows, and rated corridors. In other words, could we reasonably expect a tenant to be making such big structural changes to their apartment in order to do a short-term rental? And we said, probably not, no. In addition, leases have subleasing agreements, and most condominium associations have regulations of whether they should be allowed in their condominium associations. So we decided we were sending the wrong message with that, and we're reverting back to houses,
A
attached
question
houses.
about this whole, about what you're talking about. When you talk about a rental unit, it has to be the owner of the building, correct? Not the
Well,
rentee.
so this is what changed in our proposal, is originally we were saying they would be allowed in any unit. And now we're saying, we're just going to allow them in houses, attached houses, duplexes, manufactured home, and accessory dwelling units, not in apartment buildings or condominiums.
He's asking.
I'm asking a different question.
I'm sorry.
The
Primary residence.
primary residence, this has to be The owner and primary residence of
It's
the.
not the owner and the primary residence, it's the resident of the primary resident.
You don't have to be an owner.
You don't have to be an
You
owner.
can be a tenant in a house.
You just have to
and
be a
have lived there
primary-
for
okay.
15 years, and you want to do short-term
Okay.
occupancy.
So you just have to meet that primary residence
Yes.
criteria. Okay, thank you.
So just to build on that, so if someone rented a house, they could be, also rent out part of that house, or they could rent out rooms as accessory short-term rentals?
Correct.
Okay.
And
And would that
what-
require explicit approval of the landlord?
We are not requiring for the city to regulate that. We are proposing that that be a private issue between the property owner and the tenant.
Okay, and so in that sort of situation where, there are housing rentals that are short-term or shorter term, like a year or so, and there are housing rentals that are very long-term, how do you assure accountability, or did you have a discussion about the accountability of renters for appropriate interaction with the neighborhood and protection of neighborhood concerns in a rental situation, particularly shorter, not short-term in this sense, but non-long-term rentals?
Yeah. Can we get back to that, Gary?
Yeah.
So because I think maybe some of the neighborhood notice requirements and other things we're putting in place might help answer that question. So building type is different. Where am I? Legal bedrooms. Alrighty. So when we originally published our proposal in January and we did a lot of public outreach, we heard that people were really concerned about the safety of the bedrooms in which this activity was going to take place. So in our proposed draft, we had proposed this language, which was that the operator of an accessory short-term rental can only rent legal bedrooms. Subsequent to publishing the draft, we've been working closely with BDS and the inspection folks to figure out how are we going to operationalize that standard. And because of the varied housing stock and the building code changes that have occurred throughout, the last century, we have all concluded that it would be very difficult for residents to know whether their bedrooms were legal or not. So we are proposing an amendment to this language. And you should have an amendment memo in front of you. It's dated today. But basically, what we're saying is that instead of just requiring that the applicant say, my bedrooms are legal, we are proposing an inspection. And what our proposed language now is that the operator of an accessory short-term rental can only rent bedrooms that BDS has verified met the building code requirements for sleeping rooms at the time they were created or converted, and the bedrooms have smoke detectors that are interconnected with smoke detectors in adjacent hallways. So that is an amendment we're proposing at this time. So item number 4 is the new type A accessory short-term rental permit that would apply to 1 and 2 bedroom rentals. This would be an administrative permit. It would take about 1 to 2 weeks to process. An inspection would be required. We're proposing that a renewal be required every 2 years. The estimated fee right now is $180 for both the permit and including the inspection. And we're proposing a provision, again, to be consistent with the home occupation, that if the regulations of the code aren't being met, that it could be revoked. The permit could be revoked if there was, many, code complaints about it.
Sandra, is there a reinspection on the renewal?
Yes.
Why is that necessary?
We've talked about that too, because people make changes to their structures and for regulatory simplicity, it was just like, we'll just do the same permit again and again. And Mike can answer that more clearly too.
Question?
Yes,
Does the estimated application fee include the inspection charge?
yes, it does. So there's only 6 more of these, and they go quicker than the first 4. Okay, so the provision number 5 is that there is a notice required. The operator sends a notice to recognized organizations, in other words, a business association, neighborhood association, coalition offices, and to owners of properties abutting or across the street from the residence. And this is the drawing we have in the zoning code to make that clear. Number of guests was also something that came up, or were we going to establish a maximum number of guests? In essence, there is a maximum number of 5 guests. And what the zoning code allows for any house is that the number of occupants for the house is 1 or more persons related by blood, marriage, legal adoption, or guardianship, plus not more than 5 additional persons. So again, this is in keeping with, that's already allowed for a house. That seems reasonable for 5 people to be staying in 1 or 2 bedrooms, but not more than that. Because, how we're thinking of this, we're not just modeling that after a home occupation, but we're thinking of this as it's in lieu of a home occupation. You could be teaching piano lessons to 8 children a day. You could be washing hair and cutting hair in your house, or you could be doing a short-term rental. It's one or the other, not both.
So are you currently only allowed 1 home occupation
Correct.
per address?
Yes. And the final 3 are just clarifications that non-resident employees are not allowed. Commercial meetings are not allowed. Commercial meetings require a type 3 conditional use, and those are like weddings and banquets and other things like that that would happen in larger bed and breakfast facilities. So we just needed to clarify whether those would be allowed in these type A ones also. And private social gatherings are not limited. This is an amendment. Currently, there is a limit on the private social gatherings that are allowed with bed and breakfast facilities. And we are proposing to not put a limit. We felt that they shouldn't be limited more than any other residential use in any neighborhood. And with that, let me see. So that goes through the 10 provisions on the purple sheet, and I'm, of course, happy to answer questions once we're done with our presentations. I think overall, we feel this is a very balanced package, and we've weighed, the pros and cons of each of these provisions and talked through them. And we're looking forward to hearing what you have to say, and certainly looking forward to hearing the testimony from the public. But before we get into questions, if you wouldn't mind, I'd like to give Terry Williams a chance to tell us about the transient lodging tax program that the city has. Thank you.
Great, thank you. The city and county both assess a transient lodging, or oftentimes called a occupancy tax or a hotel motel tax, whatever term you'd like to use it. We call it a transient lodging tax. The overall rate within Multnomah County is 11.5%, which is both the city and the county's portion, and a 1% tax that's assessed by the state of Oregon. So for a total of 12.5%. The 11.5% is what the city of Portland, the Revenue Bureau, collects on behalf of the city and Multnomah County. So everyone who rents a dwelling unit, a sleeping unit within the city and within the county for purposes of 30 days or less is required to collect from the guest this hotel tax. So from our standpoint, we don't necessarily look to see if they've met other zoning codes or anything, but if you're a vacation rental, a bed and breakfast, a hotel, a motel, whatever it is, if you're renting to guests for 30 days or less, then a tax is due. Some guests, of course, might have reason to stay in a hotel for longer than 30 days. Maybe they're here on a temporary job and they're living in a hotel and they're here for 45 days or 60 days or whatever. In that case, both the laws allow those taxes to be returned when you get to day 31. So somebody who does go longer than that period will actually pay the tax and then get it refunded to them, because until you get past to day 31, the guest is obligated to pay the tax. The city's percent is 6%. The county's is 11.5%, but they give a credit back if a city assesses a hotel tax up to that 6%. So we kind of talk about the city's being 6% and the county being 5.5%, because that's effectively how the money gets divided out. We have a policy that we just changed, kind of with some anticipation of this growth in this peer-to-peer market and potentially this code change on our de minimis rental of a private home policy. The code basically says that, gives an exception to collecting the tax if the use is incidental, but doesn't really define that. And so through administrative rule and policy, the Bureau has defined that as to being a period of 7 days or less over the course of a calendar year, except for bed and breakfast, or if you actually advertise through the newspaper, online, and a variety of those sites, some of which you saw the logos up there for, that you've got a space to rent. So if you're doing that, even if you only rented for 3 days in a year because of that advertising, it's not considered an incidental use anymore. And an incidental use would be your neighbor has got family coming into town and they don't have enough room and they know you've got 2 spare bedrooms and they say, could I give you $100 to put up my family for the week when they're here for the wedding? And you say, yeah, sure, happy to do that. You know, that would be incidental. You haven't gone out and advertised, you're not competing with those other hotels and other lodging necessarily to make that. So that's an example of incidental. Anything else in the Bureau's view and under the city code is not incidental, and the tax is owed and needs to be collected from the guests and remitted to the city. I'd be happy to answer any of the questions about the tax.
Are we ready for, or you
We
got
are
one more?
ready.
Are you ready?
We're ready.
Okay. Where do we want to start? You want to start here? We'll go this way and then we'll come back around and just, Don?
I think it's great that we're focused on this, because I think this is happening in all our close-in neighborhoods. And I guess the one question I have is, Sandra, and I know you're working closely with BDS on this. Have you guys had conversations or brainstorming sessions about enforcement? Because I just think it's going to be a real challenge to enforce these well-intentioned regulations. And it would seem to me like it would almost be complaint-driven, like Amsterdam is considered. Are we going the same way? I guess I'll ask that general question of you, because I think that's going to be, even if it's well-intentioned and the language is very well crafted, how do you enforce it?
Mike can get a little more into this, but let me share one of the things that
Good.
we thought of during this project and when we were taking on this project was that there currently isn't a level playing field. Right now, these are not allowed without a conditional use review. So you saw the disparity between the number of listings, the, 1,800 or however many there are, and the 24 that have received conditional use approval.
Yeah.
So we know that these are happening, and we know that when we receive a complaint about one of them, we enforce on them. So there isn't a path for remedy other than the type 2 conditional use review. So that was one of the goals of this project, is to figure out, how to make this fair and have a path for making these legal in essence. And I'll let Mike talk to you more about enforcement.
By and large, the entire BDS enforcement program is complaint-driven, and nothing would change with this proposal. Surprisingly, with home occupation permits, we have very few complaints regarding those activities, and I would attribute that to the neighborhood notice requirement, where when neighbors understand that there's going to be something that's out of the ordinary, non-traditionally residential, they understand that there's some rules, and they understand that the person's going to be doing the following activity there. They generally understand that it may not be a violation, they don't file a complaint. But that notification also provides them the thresholds for what is allowed. And as they witness the activity grow or change, they're able to call us and communicate that they really think there's a violation, and that is something that we can investigate and potentially enforce. With current short-term rental operations, those being operated currently, the enforcement is actually pretty difficult to prove. When we try to enforce any type of activity or behavior, a land use, rather than something that's static, a development, there is a big burden of proof that the city must perform to prove a violation. We've received colorful examples of why internet sites aren't really what they appear to be, why booking calendars don't appear what they really are telling us. So I actually see this as potentially easier enforcement. Because if we find really what we're going to be going or hearing complaints or going and looking for are operations that just don't have a permit. They're not registered. And that's easy to prove. Do you have a permit? Yes, no. And if no, please get a permit. And then we would hope that it would mirror the home occupation history that we've had, where we just have not had a lot of complaints about those violations of those activity levels allowed.
That makes sense to me. And it seems like, unless you check in the marching band for the weekend, the biggest difference, kind of noticeable difference in neighborhoods will be parking.
Yeah.
And that's probably what you're going to hear the most about, I would think. That's right. So prepare for that. Thanks.
I just have, I guess a question on the number of guests. I'm confused by what's in the code, I guess. So if I'm reading this right, are you telling me that as long as you're all related, you can have as many people as you want in a household plus 5 others?
That's what the current
Okay.
code says for any household. Any residential use is that.
Okay.
So
So-
that actually kind of ties into the parking requirement too, or the parking idea that Commissioner Hansen is throwing out, is that currently, this isn't more than what a household would be allowed already.
Well, so I guess, so that's kind of where I was going. So one or more persons related by blood, blah, 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 plus not 5 more. So what if, and then that's per the whole household, not per room you've rented, I guess. That's
Right,
where-
it's
that's
for the whole
key.
household.
Yeah.
Mhm.
But, okay, so
It's
then let me go to
basically-
who lives in the dwelling unit. So would it be the operator's entire household plus 5? Because it does say who live together in one dwelling unit.
Yes, so the operator could be one person, a single person who lives in a house, and they could rent out 2 bedrooms, and let's say 2 people stay in each of those bedrooms, so that's 4 unrelated persons. The operator could be a family of 6 people, and then they could rent out 2 rooms too, and have, 4 non-related persons or 5 non-related persons.
Yeah, so I guess it's just the little piece that makes it a little bit confusing is the last piece of who live together in a dwelling unit, right?
What if
Right.
you're not married?
So-
I don't quite get this language. Go ahead.
The language
Language is
is,
very ambiguous around 2 people that maybe live together. It doesn't seem to be covered here.
no, 2
Well, it
people.
does
who-
say who live together. It doesn't say you're married.
Right.
I thought it says you had to be married.
So this language is not new language. We are just saying the language that's already used in the zoning code for household living. So this has been in the zoning code since 1980. That's the same language. And we're just saying, we're not proposing any change to that language. And we're just daylighting the fact that that language already allows for 5 non-related persons to stay in a house, whether they're staying there for 30 days or less than 30 days.
I guess what I'm getting at is I find the language confusing for this application. I see what you're getting at. It's already there, but
Right.
it's confusing for this application.
Because it says who live together.
Yeah, who live together in a dwelling unit. Yeah,
Right.
exactly.
And the code doesn't actually say, it just says the same as household. It doesn't paraphrase the language.
So I guess really what you're saying is, why couldn't you just easily say you can only have up to 5 guests per household?
No, because if somebody owns a house and let's say one person owns a house and they have 2 permanent college students that pay rent on a 30-day basis. They already have 2 non-related persons living with them, in which case they can have only 3 more non-related persons staying. They don't get 5. They
Yeah,
get
I guess
3
what-
more.
Yeah, I get.
And
okay.
part of it is to make our transportation findings, when we get to the point of doing our ordinance and getting to council, we're making the case that the people who permanently live there, plus the 5 non-related persons, is the same impact as what's already allowed, because that is what's already allowed. It's the same.
Yeah, and I follow that. I think it makes a ton of sense, but I think the
Yeah.
language is confusing for that.
So what the language says in the code, maybe I shouldn't have shared what the household living definition is. What the language says in the code is, a total number of residents and guests may occupy a dwelling unit with a type A accessory short-term rental may not exceed the number allowed for a household.
Yeah, but then you go to the
then you
definition
go
of
to the
household, which is what I did when I read that.
Right.
And then I'm like, now I'm totally confused.
Um,
That's where I'm going.
Okay.
That's all. Okay.
You hear, is this on? It's on.
Here, you can have two.
We hear a lot about fees that the city charges and that they're extraordinary and so forth, and I want to just ask a little bit about that. But first, the mayor made quite a show at the State of the City, at the City Club, about Airbnb being a new addition to the city's workforce. Did you consult with them in putting this all together? How are they on all this issue?
We have talked to Airbnb and heard their feedback to our original proposal. So we put our original proposal out. Once we published it in January, they called us and said, hey, we saw your proposal and we'd like to give you our feedback on that. And they submitted feedback on that, and I assume that they'll submit testimony straight to the commission.
Oh, you haven't
too.
heard back?
No.
from them? Oh.
No.
The other thing has to do with inspections, and I'm intrigued about the notion that you have to inspect the room, make it clean, but these people also serve breakfast, so you could have a nice bed and kill somebody with food. Is there a health inspection connected to inspection of the kitchen?
So some people don't serve breakfast.
Well-
So we, what did we say?
Actually,
Yes.
well, I was just going to say, interestingly enough, the bed and breakfasts are regulated by the state, and Multnomah County does the inspections, the health inspections for the food handling. And there is a provision that, or the definition of a bed and breakfast at the state level is a facility that has more than 2 guest rooms. So, so technically, our 1 and 2 bedrooms wouldn't be having a health inspection.
And I assume there's no liability if something like this happens to the
Right.
city if you register, right?
So one of the clarifications we made in the code, which is item number 7, is serving alcohol and food to guests and visitors is allowed and may be subject to other county and state requirements. So. if
And it's about an 11.5% city county tax, right?
For the transient lodging tax,
Yeah.
yes.
So I'll editorialize a little bit, then I have some questions. So this all falls under the heading of the sharing economy, which I'm generally a big fan of because it uses resources more efficiently. So it's typically, a sustainable practice. We use our assets better. And I think the city is a little bit inconsistent in that, we're proposing here I can share my house, I can share my car with somebody else who wants to drive it, but I can't share my car and drive somebody as a passenger. We've still kept that illegal through our for-hire transportation, which is not this commission's job, but I'll just point out, I think that's something else the city should look at. So my questions, and then I'm delighted you added the inspection. That was a big concern of mine, that basically by creating an economic incentive, we would induce people to rent bedrooms that were not legal. So I'm glad that we're addressing that through the inspection. Questions, I heard a report in the press that suggested that, I could just put an RV in my driveway, live there, and rent out my house. And I believe that's not correct, but if you would explain why that's not correct, I'd appreciate it.
The quick answer is occupation of an RV outside of an approved RV park, motorhome park, is illegal in the city of Portland, in residential zones.
All right, good answer.
Glad to hear that.
Yeah, another piece of feedback I've heard from some neighborhood activists is that we, the city, have a duty to the people who might rent these to make sure they're properly insured. It's my understanding that we don't regulate insurance on any commercial activity in the city. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And then on the revenue side, I've read in the press that Airbnb has entered into an agreement with the city of Portland where Airbnb will collect the transient lodging fees, taxes for the people for whom they're providing the service of brokering this rental. Is that correct?
We are working on that, but it hasn't been finalized, but we are working towards that, yes.
And would that tax information include a list of the residences so we could use that to make sure they all have permits?
Not unless we perform an audit. And so that's some of the agreement, that they're taking on the responsibility of providing all of the tax appropriately And so we would generally not have a list of the individual hosts.
So they would just send us a check and say, trust us, this was the amount of activity?
No, because we'd be doing audits as we
Uh-huh.
do with any other hotel or anything like that. And at that point, we would look at certain things, but
But we wouldn't audit 100% of locations, so we wouldn't identify all the addresses?
no.
Okay, thanks.
Michelle?
Okay, so back to that definition of household, I read it, and I just have a question about whether or not same-sex couples are protected under it. Is there another provision that protects them from that marriage language?
That was my point. It tells you, what if you're not married? You might not.
I think I'll talk to and get advice from our city attorney about that, because I just don't know. I haven't
Okay.
thought about that.
The second one was about limiting the number of home occupation permits you have. I guess I sort of balk at that if the other home occupation doesn't have external impacts. You know, if people are working out of their house, I'm all for it. So do you not need a home occupation permit if you don't have external impacts, or you don't have significant external impacts? I mean, if I'm coding at home and my husband is painting at home, why can't we also rent a room?
Yeah. So I was hoping not to have to discuss the type A and type B home occupation permits, because we're also using type A and type B short-term rental agreements. So for home occupations, there's a type A where you don't have an employee or customers coming to your site. You're not required to get a permit for those at all. Type B home occupations is where you have one employee or up to 8 customers a day. The code provision is that you can't do a short-term rental and a type B home occupation permit. I was just trying to be concise.
I appreciate that. And the last thing, just curious about, Chris mentioned the sharing economy. There are people internationally that do this, but they don't charge.
Yeah.
They just say, I'm a member of Couchsurfing, and contact me, we'll see if this works, you can stay. So we're not trying to get into that at all.
We're not trying to get into that or house swapping either.
Okay.
Hi. First, I wanted to compliment you on the draft that you presented. It was really clear and well presented, and it all made sense. A few questions. Beyond the occupancy tax, and I'm sorry, my hearing is really working badly today. Is there a state component to that tax in addition to the city and county component?
Yes, there's a 1% statewide transient lodging tax.
1.9?
1%.
1%. Okay, so the total tax then is 12.5.
In Multnomah County, yes.
And then is a city business license / tax required in addition to this for operating the short-term rental?
I can
type?
answer that one, too. Depending upon the gross receipts, if somebody any business, doesn't matter what it is, if their gross receipts are $50,000 or more, then they're required to pay the city's business license tax, which is actually an income tax. If the gross receipts of any business is less than $50,000, then they need to file with us, but they're exempt and they don't pay. So a short-term rental, somebody that does that would have to file both the transient lodging tax that they've collected from their guests and either an exemption, depending upon their gross receipts, or pay the actual income tax.
Okay. And the second question is more of a curiosity. In the chart, you presented the growth of listings. What is a listing? I mean, is a listing considered for a single episode of occupancy, or is it a continuous listing, or?
So a
I'm trying to relate what these numbers mean in terms of how many
Yeah,
people out there
yeah.
really want to be in this business.
Right. So a listing is going to be on the website. Each individual property will be a listing. And one of the things that happens is it changes quite a bit because it's easy
Like
to go
day to
on
day.
and off, but it would be a rental.
So this is really a snapshot at a point in time.
Absolutely.
Okay. And then the last question, on page 57, section 1B, historical landmarks. It says a bed and breakfast facility which is located in a historical landmark, blah, blah, blah. Was the continuation of the bed and breakfast language retained for some special reason? Because every place else you're talking about the short-term rental.
No, it wasn't. Thank you for pointing that out. I don't think it was, no, it was not.
So we'll just chalk that up to an editorial contribution then.
Thank you.
You read every bit of this, Gary. You are man.
My staff used to just hate me.
My staff did too, but they didn't give me enough information.
Karen?
We'll share a mic. Yeah, I really like the process. And I think that with every step of the process, you kind of up the ante on people wanting to do this so that there are clear ways that people are able to have this done in a legal way. So I like process. I'm a process person, and I think it's great. And I also like the reinspection idea because people do change things. So this is a kind of I am ignorant question. You've got type A, 1 and 2 bedrooms, type B, 3 to 5, and the fees for the type B are astronomical in comparison to the other. One would think that you went from 1 to 2 bedrooms to 3 to 5 bedrooms, maybe it would be, I don't know, 3 times the cost, but it's not. So one is a type A, one is a type 2. Why the gigantic difference in fee?
So the type 2 conditional use review is a land use review, and it requires considerable staff time. The applicant submits an application. They make their own case for how they're meeting their approval criteria. The city reviews that, makes sure that they've submitted a complete application. And then we ourselves send notice to property owners within 150 feet. We start hearing from people. It's kind of like a mini legislative process, a mini what we're doing here. And then we hear that feedback, and then the staff makes a decision, and then we issue another notice to everybody who provided feedback to that. And then there's potential appeal processes to the hearings officer, and then up to, all the way up to the Land Use Board of Appeals. So it is the 4,130 feet is not a change that we're proposing. It's what's
No.
currently on the books, and it's what BDS has assessed, over time. And they go through this with council every year. How much does it cost to administer a conditional use review? And that's the permit that has been
I'm just
approved
thinking
by
as an
council.
outsider to this,
Yeah.
that is so amazingly process heavy. Amazingly process heavy and different than the other one. When you're talking about, this is just to an outsider who's going, 1 and 2 bedrooms or 3 bedrooms.
Right.
Now I've jumped from, Taco Bell to, La Scoffier. I mean, it's like hard to imagine that the process should be so gigantically different.
And that's
Just from a logic standpoint.
Yeah,
not
and
a
that's the
city
crux
standpoint.
of this proposal, is that is what's
Well, I
on
do
the
it all
books
the time in
today.
school.
Even for a 1 and 2 bedroom, that's the process that's on the books today. And so this proposal,
Right, and so maybe the process today is something I'm talking about.
yeah.
Just because it's the process today doesn't mean it isn't something we can look at some other point as an entity and as a group. I mean, we're looking at the comp plan. So we're talking about code and prices and things. I just think it's kind of weird. But my questions are, but I like the process, and I like the way you've shown us some process. But then nobody's asked this question, and maybe I'm all alone on this, and that wouldn't be anything new. But when you heard about your feedback, and there's some feedback that says general opposition, in kind of the world I live in education, we always have to have data to back it up when we make a claim, because our constituents will always ask us, what's that based on? And they don't necessarily believe us because we say so. And that's usually a very good accountability double check for us as educators. So on page 7 of the PowerPoint, it says general opposition impacts the neighborhood livability. Was there data presented? I mean, besides parking, and what was the parking data, how it impacted livability? The other question, I wondered if people presented. I wasn't there when the presentations were made, or if they were sent to you. The economic benefit of one house at the expense of an entire neighborhood. What's the data on that? I mean, is that a philosophical question that I think you got some money I didn't get, and the neighborhood is floundering because there's extra cars. What's the logic and the data in that? Was there any presented? Is it just an opinion? Where's this coming from?
I think most of the feedback we heard, certainly our open house, we had a 2-hour open house. On recap 6, but really only one poor soul wanted to talk about something other than this issue. I think it's mostly anecdotal and mostly what people have been.
They're imagining. this
They're
is going to
imagining
happen.
what could happen. And like Julia was presenting, there isn't a lot of track record through many cities that we can point to. And then again, we're not like other cities also. So we're trying to be, sensitive to our community's aspirations for neighborhoods
No
and
doubt.
for allowing flexibility while still for allowing certainty. So I think there's been certainly a lack
I
of
just think about
evidence
the
on that.
other people that would really like this opportunity. They also have rights to try to have livability. So I just think it's a very tender balance you have
Yes.
to watch for. And that's what you guys do very well. My last question is, I like to go to Lincoln City. Of course, it's not Portland, and Yachats every year, and I rent a house. We have vacation rentals marked off on ours. Why are we not allowing vacation rentals?
Our thinking was that we were being sensitive to the availability of housing stock in Portland. We have one of the lowest vacancy rates in the city. So one of the things we wanted to do is preserve each unit for permanent residents of Portland who need to live and work here. That was our original thinking.
And just to remind folks, this is being brought forward in a recap. And remember, the recap program was supposed to be small changes. And so when you get into vacation rentals, it's just like you were saying, Karen, there's a data-driven question there we got to think through. Like, is that really a risk that you're going to
That's what
convert
it is.
houses? So we said, doing that research is not in the scope of this project.
Okay.
This other one we can solve because it's not like that.
Good.
Thank you.
That's good, Joe. That's good.
Thank you, Sandra.
So I have a whole bunch of questions.
He's got 11.
Yeah, 11. But I'm going to group them, and I'm going to group the first under residential zones. So, and I'm going to go to the part of the code that says allow for some non-residential uses, but not to such an extent as to sacrifice the overall image and character of the residential neighborhood. I'm going to pop back to New York and San Francisco because I looked at why they were saying no, and they were really saying no in rent control areas because the character of those and the intent of those neighborhoods were to provide residential units to residents of a certain income level that met the test and not change that character, even though they could theoretically, in a business case, make money by having residents come in and rent a spare bedroom and increase their livability. They thought there was a better good in this rent control. And it seemed to break the covenants of that whole process. So my kind of question is, one, the thought around density of these units. And if you go to the Airbnb kind of website and look at Portland and look at some of the neighborhoods and zoom into some of the streets, there is an incredible density along some of the streets that have more than one. And I don't know if the neighbors know, and I don't want to send them all crazy, but there's a density question, and it also gets to a question of this that someone else asked me about, loss of value. Is there an unintended consequence if, let's say, assuming a 250-foot block, you have 50-foot lots and whatever, you have 10 homes on a block, two block faces. If 50% or 80% of those homes are Airbnb or accessory rental units, is there an assumed loss of value of that home? And does the city take on that risk that someone could, I don't know. I mean, I'm just asking, but is that home as valuable to that person buying into that neighborhood? And does that become a criteria in the neighborhood you buy into? Whether or not there's a liability or not, does it become a loss of value for an intended buyer? And I don't know if there's an answer to that, but it's just one of the things. The other question is about, is this issue of, as you look at that rent control question of a San Francisco, or we don't have rent control, but we have low-income neighborhoods. And there is an economic case that if you take rental rates in some of the lower-income neighborhoods of a home, and I looked on Airbnb and looked at what they were renting the room for, if they rent it for about 15 to 20% of a month, they can get about a 25% bump in their income. Now, I know they got to pay taxes and everything, but that's a pretty substantial economic factor. This isn't a business case for me to rent a room. And I'm not renting it for a lot of money. I'm renting it for less than what they are advertised for. My question is, how do we not, because the issue of owner question last time is, how do you not prevent people in kind of a lower income status or a renter where we have large rental areas that are homes from converting those to where you could get 25% bump in your rental rate just by renting a room? How do we not prevent that kind of process from going forward? I'm not saying that we want to jump into the marketplace, but it's something to think about as we go forward. The other question I have is about complaints and required notice. Wonder if someone says, no, I don't want one. What happens?
So the proposed process is that the notice is informative. It lets the neighbors know what the requirements are, and that would be in the notice, who the contact is, they should call if they have a complaint. And really, it opens up a dialogue between the operator and their immediate neighbors. I think what Mike had been pointing out is that a lot of this is a conversation and getting on the same page and setting expectations. So it's not a vote by the neighbors, it's just a notification and an opportunity for communicating what the rules are.
Okay. Yeah, Joe.
Just on those last two are good to pair together, Andre. So remember, it's primary residence. You can be an owner or a renter, but it's your primary residence. The notice requirement lets everyone around you know it's happening and who's accountable in case something goes wrong, and that feeds into this policing system that, as Mike described for home occupations, has been pretty effective. So that notice serves the benefit of nipping in the bud any problems. But secondly, if you're a renter and renting a room and it helps you increase cover your expenses, that's actually one of the desirable reasons of having this opportunity for folks. The real problem there is, I bet your typical lease does not allow that. And so in other jurisdictions, people are getting in trouble because of their leases. So it's a problem. Especially even a lower income household renting out on this Airbnb or this short-term rental kind of way is a benefit that we'd like to be able to offer up to folks. It just gets really more complicated for a renter because the lease controls more than the zoning does.
Yeah, and I recognize that, in a lot of covenants on your residential loan, you're not supposed to rent. But that doesn't. I mean, I'm not going to go into that, but I guess at the end of the day, it's there's an economic opportunity out there for people that are in rental units to make some money. And whether the unintended consequences is potentially, some other cities have recognized that, yeah, the benefit is not as good as that unit itself in trying to preserve that unit. And that's just that. The last question I have really is about the permit. So is the person or the entity that receives the permit required to identify that permit? So you go into a B&B and they have a business license and all of those kind of things identified, you know that they're quote-unquote legit. And so,
We don't currently have that in the proposal right now. You mean like that
to
they
display
either-
the permit. Display the permit.
That's not currently a requirement.
No, and I mean, that requirement for occupancy permits generally comes from the fire department, who performs annual inspections of those. So it's not something BDS, I'm aware of, BDS requires in any of our permitting functions for a notice or a permit to be posted in a conspicuous place at a public entrance. The codes that we administer, that I'm aware of.
So if we're doing an inspection, and why would we not say that this thing's passed? I mean, that it met the requirements or require them to post it, I guess is.
We don't have a history of requiring that on other functions. We could consider that. You know, it's going to be available on the internet, so people could look up addresses to see if they are permitted before booking. Hosts could choose to advertise that information or not advertise it. It's not something
Yeah.
that I would want to put myself in a position to try to enforce that requirement, that it's part of their advertisement, that they identify that they've been approved through the city's permitting process. We could consider whether or not.
No, I just was asking
Require
whether or
that
not
in
it was
code.
and whether or not.
Yeah. Again, I guess from our perspective, this is general, still a residential use in a house, and we don't have people like post in all of our dwelling units that the maximum occupancy in our house by the fire code is that there's going to only be 52 people at a party, and that I'm kicking people out if my 53rd friend arrived. You know, so in general, we've tried to maintain that residential occupancy. It's still a house with this as an accessory use, secondary to what you would normally enjoy in a residence.
Okay. Other questions? Chris?
I just want to respond to a question that Karen asked, which is the concern that some neighborhoods have expressed that this is going to change the quality of life in their neighborhood. I came to planning as a neighborhood person, so I have some perspective for both sides of the debate. I remember that when we adopted the ADU regulations, we had testimony at that time that we would change the character of whole neighborhoods by, introducing this opportunity to build a second dwelling unit. And, it obviously hasn't happened. So, I appreciate neighborhoods that get concerned about how change will impact, what their neighborhoods are like, but I also, my experience is that often, those concerns and the reality that ensues have very little connection to each other. So, I feel pretty good about this one.
Anything else?
No, great. We look forward to the hearing on April 22nd. It's an evening hearing, 6 p.m. All of this information is posted on our website, so I hope members of the public take a look at it.
So a comment on recap 6, because this is this single issue is such a big issue, can we pull this out and vote on it separately from
We were going to
recap
talk
6?
about that, the officers' briefing, how we wanted to orchestrate the hearing itself. So
Okay,
why don't
because
we
it
just-
seems like it's not a,
Yeah, we
mean-
thought we should,
so we can do that at the officers.
at the
briefing?
officers' briefing, yeah,
Okay,
definitely.
great. Thank you.
The hearing's at your
Yes.
meeting on the 22nd, the same night.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And that's the only thing on the agenda on the 22nd.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
And yeah, absolutely.
Did you hear I said to Chris? It's a different.
Respect.
Next item, future of transit, TriMet Service Enhancement Plan initiatives. While they're getting set up, I'll say a little bit. I'm on the TriMet Transit Equity Committee, and so I've seen this enhancement plan initiative, and I think it's a great step that TriMet's taking in terms of the enhancements of service lines and getting service to people that truly need it and where they're heading. So with that, I'll leave it to Alan and Steve to go on.
Great, thanks. Should we start right away, or do you want to take a minute?
Sorry.
Do we have an official sergeant at arms?
We're gonna need one.
Karen.
Karen.
Hey,
Get my teacher voice.
Wait, were we on a break? Were we on a break?
No. Put on my suit.
On a break.
Okay, you guys ready? Okay.
Oh.
You want to recognize?
I'm ready to
Steve?
talk, but this is the presentation for the next time, or what you're going to hear from Eric and Denver. Not
Seth
me.
was,
Let's see how that goes.
I could give this one too. Thanks. I appreciate your time and I appreciate the intro. I'm Alan Lato, Director of Planning and Policy at TriMet, and with me is Steve Couts. We're both in the Planning and Policy Department, and we're doing our best to work on something that we're calling service enhancement plans, but we're dweeby transit planners, and we came up with this really boring name. And so much smarter people in our agency came up with the future of transit. And that's how we're talking about it to the public who don't want to hear three-letter acronyms after three-letter acronym. I guess before I actually get into this, I'll start by saying that, of course, we, TriMet, we're here to move people throughout the region, connect communities, allow people to get where they want to go. We're also trying to do our best to think of not just about now, but in the future. And we want to be, aspire to be, and intend to be partners with this city and the other cities and counties in the region to help fulfill future growth expectations and help guide transit service towards growth is happening and help guide growth towards places where it makes the most sense within that vision. So this is kind of a part of the way we have that conversation in different parts of the region. So let me figure out how this, there we go, okay. So first, I'll just start by saying that before I even get into the details, I'm happy to say there's a little bit of good news right now, which is just last month, we did do some adding of service on our 13 frequent service lines. So that during the midday, from the beginning of the AM peak to the end of the PM peak, every weekday, we now have 15-minute or better service. We had fallen back from that during the Great Recession, and now we're kind of surging back. So the first step was in March. The next step is proposed in our FY15 budget for September, and then again in March to be able to do the weekday evenings and then a good chunk of weekends. And if things continue to go well, we would hope to have frequent service essentially fully restored on both bus lines and MAX by the end of fiscal year 15. So that's by the June of 2015 service. Regardless, our budget at least shows that all of weekdays and a good portion of the weekends restored for both bus and MAX by that June of 2015. So starting off with that, and then I wanted to talk a little bit just about what we're doing this year, just for a little bit more context. And what we do each year, we call our annual service plan, another three-letter acronym. We haven't come up with a great name for this. But we're trying to really each time do three different things. One is basic maintenance of the system. Deal with capacity so that if there are buses that are overloaded, we should be adding more service. Deal with reliability. If there are buses that are running well behind schedule and are not reliable anymore, we need to put more resources into that service so that it can be more reliable. We need to be looking at optimizing, kind of tweaking the system and restoring, in this case, the frequent service levels. And then in the long term, obviously, each year we'll want to be looking at increases. This FY15 is much more in the maintain and restore categories than it is in the increase. But these are the kinds of things that we're trying to do each year, and I'll be talking about it in those categories. So in terms of, like I said, there are individual trips that are overcrowded. We're adding more service. There are individual trips and even lines that are having trouble being predictable, and that's basically getting caught up in traffic. And so we have to add more buses to the rotation just to keep up with our schedule, which is unfortunate, but something that we need to do to be predictable. And then, as I mentioned, the restoration of the service levels. And this is a map that kind of throws everything all in one. You get a sense of it's all over the region. However, if you pick this, look a little bit more closely, The gray lines, which I know is a little hard to pick out, there are a number on the east side, but more on the west side that stick out. Those are actually from FY14, so those are some of the things that we've just done. And the colorful lines are the FY15. So really spanning the region, but a lot of those frequent service investments are within the city of Portland because the bulk of our frequent service is within the city of Portland. We're also replacing buses, catching up to the age that we're supposed to be at in terms of keeping them attractive and maintainable, maintaining our system, and also putting some resources into making sure that the East Side Blue Line, which is now closing in on 30 years old, is getting a little spruce up. It's time for those East Side stations to feel good and new, just like some of our other lines. And we've done a few of those, but we've got a systematic plan to do all of them over the next 4.5 years. We're also, of course, working on the Orange Line opening in September 12th, 2015, and looking at how we can take advantage of that service and also send a few buses across that bridge to be able to get in and out of downtown more efficiently. So we're in the middle of service planning for that. Now for what I actually wanted to talk to you all about, which is our efforts around the future of transit. And really what we've done is recognizing that this is a big district, a big region, and we've got a lot of stakeholders and people who care to talk to, and have a communication with, and really have a dialogue with in terms of what's needed, what's out there now that we're not serving, what are the future visions, where's growth happening, where are town centers growing up, where are main streets getting more vibrant, where's new development happening, and where are things being strengthened. Within the city of Portland, obviously, we'd be looking at sort of the north end of the Pearl District, the riverfront, more in South Waterfront, and then lots of neighborhoods throughout the area. And we've kind of broken the region into 5 different, or our district into 5 different areas. And you can see a simple map up there. This is a shot from our website, trimet.org/future. And anybody who's interested can go to that and click on one of these and find out what's going on in that area. They can also sign up for updates via email, and it's been up for less than a month, and we've already got hundreds for each of these who want to find out what's going on and what the conversation is happening for each of them. What we're really trying to do is essentially work with neighbors, businesses, jurisdictions, stakeholders, social service providers, everybody who's willing to talk to us and put up with telling us what they're looking for in the future to create a shared long-term vision for transit service. And I'll talk a little bit about more about what that means. The basic model is we're doing a lot of engagement and a lot of data and understanding demographics and expectations for future growth. So we've been talking with Joe and Tom and Eric about what does the city see in terms of future growth? What are some of the projections that are coming down the line? How should we think about, not just today, but how should we think about expanding future frequent service, expanding lines to create that or to serve those needs? Create a shared vision and then go through a few iterations of, well, did we get it right? Did we hear what you were saying? Did we miss something? And create that vision and then ultimately have that vision be the template then for year after year as we're increasing service. Follow that template so that in each of these areas, those improvements follow the alignment of that template. The schedule, we've broken it out a little bit so that they're somewhat sequential because we just don't have the person power and ability to have 5 simultaneous conversations at this level. We started on the west side where there have been a lot of development and change going on and created that vision, had a lot of conversation and a lot of really positive feedback, we thought. And I'll talk a little bit about what that actually looked like and some of what we learned because I think it's instructive for all of these areas. None of the issues are exactly the same in each one, but many of them are very similar. And we hope to build on that to learn even more as we go. We've started on the east side, southwest, and southeast. Southeast specifically is aligned along with our efforts around what we should do when the Orange Line, the Portland-Milwaukee Light Rail line opens up, so that the rest of the transit network in that area makes sense with that. And then North Central is the one that we're just starting to get off the ground. And I don't have anything that shows kind of the city of Portland superimposed on these areas, but the city of Portland is in all 4 of those: North Central, Southwest, Southeast, and East Side. So it's a conversation for all of them. I want to talk just a little bit about the West Side, as I said, because I think it's instructive for some of the stuff we heard and also kind of expect to hear as we're going forward. So, yeah, go ahead.
I want to get a perspective on North Central. Could you
Yep.
give me a visual on that?
Yeah,
Is that
let-
Killings? Is
let me
that,
see if I can go back here.
Lombard area?
This graphic, which I flashed by really quickly, think in terms of the region as a whole rather than just the city.
Okay, I see it.
So North Central is really Division North. And
And it's
this
getting the
side of
lowest- It's
I-205,
getting the lowest highlight right now.
it's the last to start up.
Okay.
And the southeast, obviously, is from Division South, this side of 205. East side is everything east of 205. Southwest is west of the river and south of 26, basically.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
So what you see here is on the west side, which is essentially Beaverton Transit Center and Sunset Transit Center and west. This is a really idealized graphic of what the current service looks like. Obviously, none of the roads run that straight, but it gives you a sense. And the darker the color, the more frequent it is. And you can see there's somewhat of a grid structure because we're not all about going just to a single point anymore as we were in the 70s. But it's not a complete grid structure, more like what we have on the east side of Portland today, at least as far as 205. And where what we heard a lot was many different needs, but what we ended up with was a vision that kind of creates a more filled in grid, more frequency, more connections, and sort of rationalizing some of the routes that are wandering around a bit today and creating more of a true network rather than a collection of routes. And you see considerably more frequency on there, as well as some potential for places like Tualatin Valley Highway to get bus rapid transit. I'm going to walk through a couple of these and then come back for why this is relevant for what we're talking about here. So what we recommended from what we heard was we had heard lots about the need for better connections. And that grid of service is really important. You can't run everybody, just like in the 60s and 70s, when we inherited the bus system, it was almost all about bringing people to downtown Portland. And if you wanted to go almost anywhere else, you had to come into downtown and move back out. Well, we evolved from that in the 80s pretty strongly on the east side, but not as much in other parts of the region. And so we're trying to continue that evolution and really try to make those better connections. And that grid of service is important because it allows you to go from almost anywhere to almost anywhere with just one transfer rather than 2 or 3 are going way out of your direction. We heard a lot about wanting less waiting and faster trips, and that's obviously about adding frequency and looking at ways to get transit priority treatments and other improvements in key corridors to be able to speed those trips and reduce delay. We absolutely heard a lot, and we hear this everywhere in the region about the critical necessity for safe places to walk, to wait for transit, and to be able to cross the street. Every jurisdiction, the mayor of Cornelius just yesterday was talking about how important their sidewalk infrastructure on their main street has been and how transformative it has been for walking in that neighborhood and how important it is for access to transit. And we hear this everywhere. And though obviously the older parts of Portland on the east side don't have too much trouble, Southwest certainly does, and there are other parts of farther east Portland that have these kinds of challenges, and we're paying attention to them.
What did you just say about the east?
Farther to the east, especially past I-205, have many places without sidewalks or, that are still need the sidewalks filled in and don't have safe crossings necessarily. So we're still building on those. And have actually we've worked with the city to, and other partners to identify, I think, over $20 million worth of capital funds in the next few years to be able to do things like complete the sidewalks, add safe crossings, and fulfill some of that East Portland in Motion kinds of improvements that you've probably seen. Bridging the last mile, there are certainly places where this is an issue, and we look at the whole range of possibilities between improving pedestrian improvements, bicycle connections, car share, bike share, anything we can look at in terms of possibilities. And then community transit. There are some places where a fixed route line doesn't necessarily make sense because you're going to have pretty low ridership, but the community still really wants circulation. And we've been able to do some things like partner with the city of Forest Grove to create a local circulator called Grove Link that makes those connections in a place where a fixed route doesn't necessarily make sense. So enough of West Side. All 5 of those things, better connections and safe places to walk and more frequency, less delay, they're all things we're hearing already in all of the other areas. And there's no surprise in that. But we're trying to make sure we understand how it applies in each of these areas and understand, well, okay, we're starting to hear themes, but what does it really mean on the ground in individual places? So these are some of the graphics we grabbed from our website, the trimet.org/future. For each of these areas, we've kind of given each one a little bit of a different flavor and try to pick up some of the development flavor of those areas. So what we're doing right now is talking to partners in the region, community agencies, advocates, organizations, neighborhoods, districts, jurisdictions. We're doing some general community meetings, though we recognize that we really have to go to where people are rather than try to ask them to come to us, so we're doing both. A lot more of going to people where people are. Doing a number of one-on-ones with stakeholders, and we've got the online Future of Transit, but we've also done surveys and other methods of trying to get sort of needs, wants, wishes, as well as demographic analysis of our ridership, using anything we can to try and understand what's out there now and what we need to look at in the future. So I already gave a hint of what we're hearing, but just a little bit more. On the east side, more north-south lines. 148th, 162nd don't have service right now. 122nd has service, but it's not as frequent as many people would like. 182nd, 181st has north-south service, but it's not as frequent as many people would like. And so we're hearing a pretty consistent theme that's consistent with what some of the others, which is, yeah, we understand that the lines that are long, connect lots of places, and ultimately end up in downtown Portland have the highest ridership, but we really care about that complete grid, not just about those lines. And so you have to strengthen the whole grid to make it really work. Same thing with Southeast. We're hearing about east-west service in that case. How can we make more connections without having to come into necessarily even a transit center, much less downtown Portland? And Southwest, a lot about frequency and midday service. And then really all of them, everybody wants more service. This is a great problem to have. We can't afford to give what everybody wants right now, but if that's really what everybody wants, we're going to do our best to meet that and then in the long term grow towards it. And again, that access is vital. How do we make those connections so that people can safely get to our service? And that has a double, triple whammy. It has public health benefits of people being able to walk in their own neighborhoods. It has the benefits of neighborhood development and community connections to be able to move around. This is again, just to hammer on our website, we're trying our best to make sure that this is one way that people can come and find us. Those people who are plugged in can, but we're also finding lots of ways to get plugged into the people who are not online, who are not involved, and not going to come out to a public meeting to talk about the future of transit, but are willing to give us a few minutes in the communities where they already are, whether that be a neighborhood base, a business base, a faith base, whatever, to try and go out and have those conversations. So with that, I think I'm going to stop talking specifically about this. I introduced Steve, but Steve, if you wanted to add anything else, and then I'd be happy to respond to anything.
Okay.
I can wait.
Oh, okay. Go ahead, Steve.
No, I just, again, we appreciate the opportunity. We had a chance to, last September, we had a chance to meet with Chris. I think it was set up for the executive officers of the commission, and Andre had highlighted your interest in the initiatives, so we thought we wanted to be sure and come back while we're still pretty early in our process, really still in the initial phase of public engagement in the active sub-areas. So we thought the timing would be very helpful for us. And I guess I should say, I mean, this has been a really positive conversation for us in that, you know, for one reason, we're out of the cutting realm, and that's been so heartrending. To be able to talk about the future is enlightening, but to be able to talk about people's needs and how they rely on transit has been really informative for us. I'll just share that, you know, I went, as a kid, I grew up in Seattle, and I was totally dependent on the bus, and that's what got me around. That's what gave me freedom. You know, my mother was a single parent. She wasn't going to drive me anywhere. She was working all the time. This is how I made my life work, and I still base a lot of my life around our transit service. And it's really heartening to be able to do our best to try to build towards that for others.
Great. Mike?
Yeah, just some feedback. I sat through 2 days of Metro's Climate Smart Communities workshops recently, and it was the equity community was very heavily represented in those conversations, and basically everything you reported today we were hearing in that session in terms of people's needs. And there was a lot of, you know, there was some focus on freight, but almost all of it was on TriMet and the need to create those better connections. And Spoken Wheel was mentioned numerous times. And so I'm just want to give you some feedback that what I heard today was very consistent with what we were hearing in those. And then a quick question. I've tried to use my bike on especially on Max, numerous times, and basically have given up. And I'm just curious if there are other systems out there that can accommodate more bikes.
On Max specifically?
Yeah.
Given the length of our trains, we're pretty constrained.
Yeah.
There are, you know, the places that have been more successful than us in getting even more vehicles, even more bikes on board, are the ones that have multi-car trains and usually commuter rail trains where they even set aside a car for that. But we just don't have the physical capability to do that. So what we're trying to do is, our worst pinch point is through the tunnel on the west side. And so we're trying to have better storage opportunities on both sides. And we're actually partnering with Nike right now to see if we can get some good storage on this side and then some good last mile connection on that side so that some of their employees, for example, who are coming through the tunnel every day don't have to bring their bike on board.
Thanks.
Howard?
I want to thank you for your testimony as well, and take a step back and say that rather than we visiting with each other in these hearings, but that we should be more partners in what we are going forward. That a lot of your plans and our plans are coincidental, and that we could come to a point where we're all talking to the city council or Metro with the same voice. I really appreciated your personal experience because I think you represent who needs TriMet and transit the most. And that's why I kind of reacted to the north, because I feel there's a lot of population there that's going to need transit, and it's evolving rather quickly. So I appreciate the testimony. I hope it's more than a conversation, but rather a partnership, that we can come back and say, you guys are out of line by 15 streets. Get yourself back in order. and that we'll be pleased to have you do that.
That sounds great. We certainly have already had a number of conversations with PBOT and BPS staff about how we make that a partnership. We even, with PBOT staff, pursued some funding for basically a transit master plan as an element of the TSP. The funding didn't come through, but we're figuring out, okay, what of that conceptual scope can we actually do together and have it be part of this conversation? And how do we then reflect that in any of the city plans and policies?
So following up on Howard's comment, I think one area that this commission has a lot of concern and interest in is job access in East Portland. So I think at the point where your East District ideas come together, I think we'd love to get an early look at those and have a chance to comment on those. And I'm curious how your conversation with Opal is going. They're a primary group for expressing equity interests for, I'd say, mostly the East County population, although they have a broader perspective as well. I know a lot of their concern has been focused, obviously, on transfer times. If you want to comment on that, you can. I'm not going to push you to do that. But the conversation about the appropriate dedication of resources to the high-capacity network versus the frequent service network, and what's your state of conversation with them about that resource allocation?
Frankly, for this, what we've really been focusing in on is how can we help each other to better understand the needs, rather than, we as an agency are having a conversation with Opal about the transfer times and about the resource allocation overall. I guess I should have said this process is really more about the transit network rather than trying to pick out specifically capital improvement projects. If we hear pretty strongly or it seems really obvious that there's something out there that seems like a real opportunity, like bus rapid transit on Tualatin Valley Highway, that a lot of stakeholders are interested in, we'll kind of put that out there and say, this seems like an opportunity, but that's part of a regional conversation and a broader sort of long-range budget balancing conversation. This is about how we describe what the system should look like so that we have a template year after year after year when we're increasing service. Where should we put it and how do we respond to that?
Thanks.
I will say that, at this level, in terms of who do we engage and how do we learn better, our conversations with Opal have been great.
And I'll comment a little more because I have some more information too. Michelle?
I just wanted something translated. You talked about providing local circulation in areas that are not supportive of fixed route service. What is that?
So, sorry for the nomenclature. Fixed route service is your typical bus, has defined bus stops, has a defined schedule. To be able to, for the way we provide service, given the fact that we pay relatively good wages and have good benefits and all of that, you really need to have something like on the order of 15 people getting on per hour for it to kind of make financial sense. If you're talking about and the best lines that do that are ones that are relatively long, have a number of relatively significant places that are connected, and a mix of places. So it's not all single-family homes for the entire. The places that I'm talking about tend to be places where at one time we would put a bus out that kind of did this, and then hardly anybody would ride it because nobody actually wants to do that, or very few people want to do that. If you have a sort of local neighborhood circulator that's a completely different kind of process, that's, for instance, in Grove Link, a partnership with Ride Connection, and has a different way of providing service and has the ability to respond to some needs and is really about sort of that very extremely local connectivity. That's a slightly different kind of service than we provide directly, so we look for partners to be able to do that.
And that's sort of an on-call service?
It could be, but in this case, it's a more regular route, but it has some deviations to it.
Gary?
Yeah, I was really appreciative of the fact that community transit networks were on the agenda and really would encourage you to pursue those more. And that's really follow up to what you were asking, Michelle. Recent experience in Northwest Portland with the closure of the Balch Creek Bridge, they've gone over to a van system, which is really superior to the big bus. It's faster. It's more appropriately sized for the ridership. There's, I'm sure there's other advantages to it. And also some recent travels in South Asia where there's a very privately oriented multimodal system where there's big intercity buses, big intra-city buses, little taxis, tuk-tuks, a bazillion ways to get around. Or in Mexico, the colectivos. There's lots of ways to organize these community transit systems, and they actually move people very efficiently. And I think they would take us a long way with their increasing density and the impossibility of parking in many neighborhoods. You know, the option to hop on a van for $1 would be an incredible asset to the individuals and to the businesses in the community. So I encourage you to continue to look at that.
Thanks. I will absolutely, and we're very interested in being able to do that. That particular example, I should point out that the cost to do that is more than was the cost to just provide the regular bus service going up and down there, because we're chopping it off, and the way we have to provide it actually doesn't take advantage of some of the efficiencies. So we'll be watching the ridership to see how that does and what implications that has for the long term.
So Gary, referencing
Thank you.
back to my comments during the Airbnb discussion, there's a sharing economy approach to that, which is you have people with vans and iPhone apps who can connect with their customers, and that's part of what we as a city don't allow to be legal right now. I think we should take a broader look at.
So that for some of the public-private partnerships.
That's a great, Gary's example is a great one, actually, where a whole neighborhood is literally cut off and has to find a way back through itself, and how to make transit work.
Yeah. And it's a really good solution that's been implemented there temporarily.
Thanks.
Yeah, I wanted to just say that I appreciated Chris's comment about OPAL. OPAL stands for Organizing People, Activating Leaders, and they have a project called Bus Riders Unite. They're an environmental justice group, and I think it is important that you listen to what they have to say. Currently, I think I'm the only superintendent that meets with them, but I think it has a lot to do with the people we serve across the city, and I'm appreciative of that mention. I also wanted to just state that I appreciate the fact that Steve meets with the East Portland Action Plan Technical Advisory Group every other month as part of TriMet, and part of that whole technical advisory group talking about transportation in East Portland. And because you show up, that's half the battle. So it's very appreciated. So one question that I have is, you're talking about the future of transit. Shouldn't the future of transit follow the predicted population and employment growth that's been predicted? So it's been predicted that the population growth is going to be out east. So wouldn't it make sense that part of your futures planning would also take into consideration kind of the census and the predictive reports that the city has come up with, where they think the population is going to be? Park Rose School District in the next decade is slated to grow by 40%. So one would think that that's where the future of transit might be. How does that interplay?
Yeah, that's exactly, I probably mumbled through it too quickly, but that's exactly the kind of stuff we're looking at, both in terms of understanding, census and some of the recent change, but also working with city staff to see where are the projections of that growth and the change in both in demographics and in new development, to see, how do we keep up with that, and in some ways where we can get ahead of that.
So we're sharing with them the draft comp plan sort of forecasts and scenarios as they're developing, or will be shortly. So.
And that's exactly it. I guess I should also say, because I don't think I mentioned it in here, there are a lot of things that are pointing to the very clear need for us to do not just a sort of an incremental growth in transit, but a pretty dramatic growth in transit over the next 20-some years. The RTP, for example, the Regional Transportation Plan, calls for tripling our mode share. And we really kind of need to double our service to be able to do that, something in that range. Somewhat coincidentally, because it wasn't absolutely sort of what we were targeting, the West Side vision that I showed you is approximately a doubling of service. And we certainly expect that these other areas are going to be in that kind of a range, because if we don't double service, we're not keeping ahead of population growth. We're not doing enough to keep ahead of congestion and the need to connect people to all of their, jobs, education, medical, whatever else. And we're not doing enough to keep ahead of climate change and the other needs that we're trying to address with our service.
Good. First, I want to thank you for coming and doing the presentation. It's good to, I know we had the briefing a while back, but it's good to have kind of that partnership. And as we've talked about, really to, as we go through the comp plan, understand what TriMet's doing, because part of our comp plan success is, I think, based upon what you guys are going to do, and that matching of, we're looking for density here, can we get the ride share and get the transit to match? And so I think it's good. To Opal, at least all I can speak to is on the Transit Equity Committee that I'm on. They're very engaged. They press. They're full court press. But it is good, I will say, in the enhancements that they brought back. They talked about transit dependent riders and the service enhancements that were looked at and really TriMet put in place really addressed kind of the evening, which really spoke to their group and the transit dependent folks and the elderly and the low income and minorities. So they keep, I will say they keep that at the forefront of TriMet's kind of vision. And as they go through this process, they will have a voice, and TriMet does listen to them, and so it's a good process that they're going through. And I'm appreciative of the comment that you made, Alan, about as we look forward and working with Joe and staff from BPS, that really my goal is how do we get some of the people that are not riding transit to get to transit, especially in the East County. And part of that is just putting more buses out there and stuff, I think. But it really is not only more buses, but then we got to get them on the bus, so to speak, or on the train and get that transition. And that is part of what Chris talked about, that connection from, household to job and making those connections. So one is part of the process we're doing in the comp plan, but the other part is connecting that future with how does transit connect into that future to really not only be ahead of that game, but also change the behavior out there with individuals in those future communities. Mike?
Yeah, I've gotten into quite a few conversations. I keep bringing up Curitiba a lot because I think that bus rapid transit, when you compare the cost with light rail at 10% the cost or whatever it is, in that case, I think it was about that. And the response I get from folks are two. One is people won't invest on those lines, even if they're dedicated lines. That's another issue. A lot of people respond, well, people just don't want to ride the bus. They prefer to ride a train. And I'm just curious, when you talk about the future of transit, how much thought is going into the quality of the ride, the quality of the vehicles? Are there things that you've seen in other cities that have been done to make a bus experience more akin to the train? Or
So let me answer that in a couple of different ways. One is sort of the higher end experience of a bus is in a bus rapid transit kind of implementation. And Eric and Denver are going to give you a presentation on the Southwest Corridor in a minute. And one of the options on the table for that is a bus rapid transit. And there will be different flavors, I'd like to say, of that bus rapid transit, but that really is where you get the highest and best out of the bus. You're not going to hear today, but I should have mentioned, at the same time, essentially the same time we're doing that, we're also looking at the Powell Division corridor for a transit improvement. And that could be a bus rapid transit as well. And that could be a different flavor of bus rapid transit. More sort of higher capacity buses typically. We look at stations rather than stops. We look at doing everything we can to try and reduce delay along the way and try to make it as much a part of the sort of very visible, high level part of the system. The way if you're a tourist and you go to a city, or if you're not a regular transit rider, all you really notice is the rail system often. Well, BRT can try to become part of that And the jury's still out a little bit around the country about how well it does that. But clearly, the better you do, the more return you can have on it. So that kind of at the high end, we're looking at 2 corridors where we're very interested in that as one potential solution. As far as our system as a whole, I don't know how often you ride, but our brand new 3100 buses are definitely a step above our older buses. And we continue to try to, the industry is trying to, and we're trying to make sure that we're getting buses that are more comfortable, lower emission, all quieter, all of that, and doing the best we can on that. At the same time, we're also pursuing other technologies, like we're literally next week putting in a grant application for some electric buses to test that out. It's basically battery powered that charge at stations or at the ends of the line to reduce the noise both inside and outside and it reduce the emissions, obviously. And we're looking at CNG to do some of those same kinds of things. So we're trying to push the envelope a little bit on the bus. Our first step, though, as I mentioned, is we got to the point where our average bus age was, 12 or 13 years, and a well-maintained system is 8. And within a couple of years, we'll be back to 8, and then we'll keep going from there in terms of looking at the better technology as we go.
Great.
Catherine?
Just to pick up on that real quick, and forgive my naivete, do you provide wireless, or have you considered providing wireless as a rider amenity?
We've done some consideration of it. It's fairly expensive. There are other systems that we know of that started and then had to cut it because of the costs. The only place it's available right now is on West because it kind of came as the package. So we've heard some of the interest in doing that. We expect to hear more. I don't know that it's certainly not our first priority as we're restoring service. But, the more we hear, the more we'll be able to understand how much interest there really is in that.
Goes with increasing ridership in a peculiar way. Really,
Yeah.
more people probably would if they could.
Well, just
Absolutely.
to piggyback on that, I was recently in an airport somewhere where instead of free Wi-Fi in the airport, you had to agree to download some commercial app. So like if you download Amazon is sponsoring your Wi-Fi. So there might be a way to get somebody else to pay for it.
Yeah, I haven't seen that model in the transit industry yet, but that doesn't mean it's not out there. It's just not kind of in my wheelhouse. Oh,
Talk to Google.
one other thing I'd like to mention, because I forgot to earlier, is in addition to Steve Couts, I also have Vanessa Visar, who's on TriMet staff in the department and is also working on both the east side and the southeast service enhancement plans, and is making a lot of connections with people in the neighborhoods and communities.
Great. Any other last questions? Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thanks.
Look forward to you coming back.
Great.
Next, we have a briefing,
personal with you and Max.
Southwest
They were
Corridor
trying to hit
Plan,
you.
Eric and Denver. Eric's not
I'm
here.
not kidding you, Mike. You and Mike.
Take it on.
Max. You and Max.
Yeah, come on up, Malu. Good afternoon, Commissioners. Thank you for having us. My name's Denver Igarda, and I'm a transportation planner with the Portland Bureau of Transportation, and I'm here with Malu Wilkinson, who is the project manager for the Southwest Corridor from Metro. And Eric is not here. He called. He was actually at the airport when he called, so he's unable to join us. But I'm here representing a City of Portland team that includes staff from both BPS and from PBOT, and also here John Fredrickson and John Gillum from BPS, and Teresa Boyle just walked in from transportation. So in addition to the City of Portland staff that's participating, this is obviously a regional project, including the fact that it's being led by Metro, but also TriMet with partnership from ODOT, the 2 counties, and the local jurisdictions within the Southwest Corridor area. And this is, I'm really glad that Alan was able to give that presentation just before ours, because I think it's a really important part of understanding our transportation system. And he was explaining how, as we look to the future transportation system, we need to be thinking about how our entire transit system plays a role in in the transportation system. So we're talking about Southwest Corridor, which is high-capacity transit project, but I'm sure you're familiar with it over the last few years. We've come to you as the plans have developed. And so just to start off, I wanted to just look back to where this started and why, and how this project was initiated. And it was in 2009 when the region adopted its high-capacity transit plan, which essentially identified 16 corridors for expansion of the high-capacity transit system, which you see on that screen. The corridors were identified based on a range of factors that are listed there, but included ridership and transit demand and costs, and also importantly, the realization of our regional growth concept, the 2040 growth concept. What the plan also did was it prioritized the next corridors for study and implementation, which included 3 corridors, 2 of them in the city of Portland. So Southwest Corridor was one, and PAL Division Transit Corridor was another one. And the PAL Division corridor project is underway. I understand you were, I think staff was here last month to give an introduction to that process. And so this plan was the first one to identify those 2 as near-term implementation. And so that's how this all started. But for the city of Portland, really where work started on the high-capacity transit for Southwest Corridor was the Barber Concept Plan, which was led by the planning office, and it was initiated in 2011. And I'm just going to do a quick overview of some of the things that we've past plans and that are now informing the work that we're doing, as Malu explains where we are with Southwest Corridor. So in 2011, all the local jurisdictions, Tigard, Tualatin, and City of Portland, developed local land use visions to identify what are the areas along the corridor that we want to see transformed through a high-capacity transit investment. And so in April 2013, the Barber Concept Plan was adopted with the goal of leveraging the high-capacity transit investment to create more walkable and vibrant communities along Barber. And that plan was developed with guidance from a community working group, which met over the course of a year and a half or so, or 2 years. And the preferred concept from that plan was what was extremely valuable from that process was the community came to a consensus on the strategy for how Barber would develop. And the preferred concept was targeting these medium-density mixed-use nodes along Barber. So you can see those on the left side of these kind of dark purple shaded areas, and the shading is illustrating the level of development intensity with connected by less intensive segments of Barber. And the nodes were identified based on existing services and land use, zoning, and also opportunities for connecting across I-5. 7 focus areas were identified, which is the circles on the map on the right-hand side. Those 7 areas are now the areas that are being considered as part of potential station areas for the high-capacity transit project, in addition to some more detailed and defined station area planning. Just wanted to review really quickly what was adopted in the Southwest Corridor Plan in October of 2013. In addition to endorsing the plan, the resolution gave us some good direction for how to continue the process, working with our partners, specifically for the ongoing high-capacity transit planning, continued City of Portland participation in that regional effort, and really focusing kind of the Barber Concept Plan vision for land use and development along the corridor as a basis for our decisions in the high-capacity transit process. We also formed a community working group, which has been meeting every month and we've been sharing information about the project and working through the multimodal transportation projects that are supportive of high-capacity transit and trying to refine those projects to make them more ready for implementation. So that monthly meeting with the community has been very helpful for us to share information, but also to give them and engage them with the details as the project is developing. So I'm
Denver, excuse me, quick question. As I read in the press, Tigard is somewhat resistant to mass transit in the future. And on the topic of collaboration, even though they've made that move, or a faction in Tigard has made that move, do they remain active with your group, and are they communicating and collaborating on this future plan?
Yeah, they are remaining active since the vote that occurred. It was ballot measure 34-210, and I actually was going to share this later, but maybe I'll do this now.
You can do it later.
I spoke with, as I was preparing, spoke with Commissioner Novick, and he wanted me to share a few words about the Tigard vote, especially to recognize and acknowledge that there was this vote and in Tigard on high-capacity transit. And so I can just share his statement, and then we'll have Malou continue the presentation.
You can do it when you're ready to do it, Denver.
This is as good a time as anyway,
Isn't
I
it,
think.
though?
Yeah.
Okay, good.
Is this a
It was
setup?
the perfect
Were you
segue.
set up to do this? Oh.
All right, so this is what Commissioner Novick shared with me. It's we realized that you might be wondering about the impact of the Tigard vote on Southwest Corridor planning. Very.
Prophetic.
As you know, the vote was very close, and the measure's proponents themselves say that the measure did not prohibit Tigard from participating in planning efforts. Chair Dyke of Washington County came to City Council last week to reiterate the county's support for continued planning, corridor planning. Still, I think all of us would be more comfortable if Tigard had a clarifying vote in which citizens say, in effect, it's okay to continue the planning, the study process. Based on the statements that Tigard's mayor and councilors have made so far, it appears that it is quite likely that this will happen and that the city will ask voters for such a clarification. In the meantime, I do not want to lose the momentum we have for adding Southwest Corridor high-capacity transit to our toolkit to reduce congestion and improve livability in the corridor. Half of the mileage of any likely alignment would be within the city of Portland's limits, and so we have quite a stake in this project. So the clarifying vote that the commissioner is mentioning looks set to happen in the fall.
Great.
Yeah.
Thanks, Denver.
So would it be fair to interpret that if the vote outcome is not to do planning, that Portland would not continue planning alone, or would they continue planning alone?
Do you want me to?
Yeah, sure.
Take. So I also have, I have the statement that Mayor Cook released right after the vote that we can make available to all of you. But essentially, Mayor Cook and the Tigard City Council, they've clearly been talking about this. They feel like they have the backing of the majority of the citizens of Tigard to move forward based on the polls that they've been doing over the last, in 2011, 2013, they've done polling of their city over a wide variety of topics, but one of the specific questions that they've asked is related to high-capacity transit and in particular light rail, and they've had overwhelming public support for increased transit service in Tigard. So they feel like it makes, the vote was, it was within 200 votes, and so they feel like it was very close. They'd like to also clarify, because there was a lot of information that was flying in the lead up to that vote, some of which, as we go through the presentation, I'll just call out the one thing that was a misconception out there in terms of what people might have been voting on. So the vote matters, and we need to engage people more effectively as we move forward, so we're sure that everyone has a voice. But Tigard is at the table. They've made it clear that they want to be at the table moving forward. And at the steering committee meeting, which was yesterday, I think, all of the steering committee members, which include all of the other cities and Washington County, Metro, TriMet, ODOT, we all agreed that we should continue moving forward collaboratively. Tigard wants to be at the table, and so we want to continue to work on this project together.
And
But-
Portland would hardly be alone. I think Washington County is going to put in almost $1 million to the DEIS funding, right?
But I mean,
A lot
I
of people's
guess,
skin in the game.
well, the skin in the game, but if Tigard says no, it's just going to the city limits, correct? It would just go, I mean, you can't cross Tigard's land without,
I don't know that we really want to get into the technical details of what's actually legal and what would be politically feasible. I think that those are really two different things.
Two folks from Philadelphia, is that what you meant? Yeah.
But we're not there. The city of Tigard feels very strongly that they do want to have an advisory vote in November to clarify what the citizens were saying with that vote, because it was an unclear ballot measure and it was so close. So I
There might
think
be 200 more voters.
there might be 200. Yeah. Okay, go ahead with your presentation.
So we'll make sure that you get a copy of that. So I don't want to redo anything that you've heard before, but, this has been very much a collaborative partnership. Can I move this, or should I just move? I don't want to unplug anything. So as we began phase one, this was the collaborative partnership. Everybody is still engaged, but Lake Oswego and Multnomah County, as we moved from phase one into phase two of the Southwest Corridor plan, felt like they didn't need to be at the table at the steering committee level anymore, as we kind of narrowed down what we were looking at. So they're still engaged. And Denver talked about, he went back to the high-capacity transit system plan and how we began looking at the Southwest Corridor based on that. One of the reasons that this corridor rose to the top was really the significant growth that we're anticipating in the Southwest Corridor. And so it both was, as we worked through the land use planning, we had, at the regional scale, forecast significant growth, but then we worked with each of the cities to work on their land use visions, and that was corroborated by, the regional forecast was corroborated by what the cities would like to see within their downtowns, main streets, and employment areas. So we're expecting significant future activity, and we have a lot of traffic congestion in this corridor that's a real problem today. Denver talked about how this has been a vision-based approach. I just wanted you to see this map. I don't want to re-say what he said, but all of those circles were really the places that the cities identified as being most important to connect, and that's how we started out this transit plan. We really want to be sure that we're aligning how we invest in transit in a way that can support the community land use vision, rather than looking at where it is most, where it's easiest to invest in transit. So we want to go to where the communities want to see their visions realized. So last summer, the steering committee made a recommendation that was endorsed by each project partner last fall, and the Metro Council formally adopted it on October 31st last year. That included 4 main elements. The transit component, I'll get into more detail as we go along, but one of the key recommendations of the steering committee was what Alan was just talking about, which is the service enhancement planning. So TriMet immediately began last summer to work on the Southwest Service Enhancement Plan, and so that's been going on, and you'll hear more about that as TriMet develops that vision for future local transit service over that. I think that it's anticipated to be sometime at the end of 2014 or early 2015. The high-capacity transit piece, I'll talk about more as we get along further. The recommendation also included over 60 multimodal projects. Those are really their roadway, bicycle and pedestrian projects that support the land use vision and high-capacity transit. And it also included over 400 green projects. Those are parks, trails, and habitat improvements that is a really terrific inventory of the way that we could invest in the green element of our communities. And we didn't make it up. It came from all of the project partners, not just the cities, but also the natural resource agencies. So we have this inventory that we want to keep bringing up and try and figure out how we can get it put in place on the ground over
the course of the Southwest Corridor Plan. And another element of that recommendation are the policies and incentives that are needed to support the market in developing the kinds of buildings on the ground that are envisioned by the communities in all of these different places. Those are the main pieces of the steering committee recommendation. That moved us from the end of phase 1 of the Southwest Corridor Plan into what we're calling a refinement phase, where we started out looking from Portland to Sherwood and Lake Oswego to Beaverton. We've narrowed down what we're looking at for high-capacity transit from Portland to Tualatin via Tigard. You'll see a map in a couple minutes. And so, but we still, in that time frame, we weren't able to get into the details. We needed to do some design work to make a narrowing decision that could actually move us forward into a better understanding of the positive and negative impacts of different design options in terms of implementing high-capacity transit from Portland to Tigard, to Tualatin via Tigard. We also have this big list of complementary multimodal projects. It adds up to over $500 million, and that's more than you can actually, it's certainly more than you can have as part of a high-capacity transit project. So we, over this refinement phase, we're narrowing down to identify those multimodal projects that are most complementary to the high-capacity transit design options that we're looking at and identifying what should actually be further studied in an environmental impact statement. And we're really using the land use vision, as Denver showed you those maps of the Barber concept plan that is applicable in the other cities as well. We're using the land use vision to identify potential station locations and working with the cities to better understand the opportunities of the different station locations to help inform which design options we should keep moving forward to study further and looking for opportunities to incorporate those green projects as well. So I wanted to just get back to our policy guidance as we're moving through this process, because this is something that you, at least some of you, were engaged in terms of giving us some feedback on the purpose and need. A purpose and need is a required document that really guides the work of any federal transportation planning project. And so we identify why we're doing it, what needs we're trying to solve for, and that's a really important piece that helps us in a narrowing decision as we're moving through this refinement phase. So we started out with a purpose and need that the steering committee adopted on transit in September of 2012. We were looking at that huge area at that point. So this last year, last fall, we worked to refine that based on the steering committee recommendation last summer that was adopted by the partners. And in January, we had a refined version of that a number of you gave some really important input on that. So this guides.
How many of our edits made it in there?
What's that?
How many of our edits made it in there?
I couldn't count, but I know that most of them.
Good, glad to hear that.
We really, it doesn't seem like a very exciting document, but it's a very important document. And so we appreciate it when people take the time to actually
The
go
input
through.
was primarily to better align with the Portland plan, so I'm glad we were able to do that.
Very helpful. So this purpose and need really guides our assessment of the positive and negative impacts of the design options and helps us as we narrow forward. We're going to be reopening that purpose and need, assuming we move forward into an environmental impact assessment in the scoping period. So it's, we're not done with it. There's another chance. But I wanted to just give you an example of how it how it might work. So we have on the left-hand side are some of the reason, some of the bullet points from the purpose and need, shortened into 3 or 4 words. So they're all longer than that. And then across the top of that are the main impacts that we're looking at right now in terms of providing information to the public and our steering committee to weigh the different design options. So every design option will get scored in some way. And so this is just a way to crosswalk between the purpose and need and what we actually are able to measure. So I just wanted to show you that so you can see how we use that purpose and need in our decision-making process or to inform the decision-making process. I also wanted to just briefly let you know that we are, equity is one of the bullet points in the purpose and need. It is really important to us, and I just thought you talk a lot about equity at the City of Portland scale, but we are also thinking about it at the regional scale. This is not a Metro map, but Metro collaborated with the Coalition for a Livable Future to do this Equity Atlas. And what this shows are communities of color where there are higher concentrations of them. And you'll notice that the city of Portland almost, there are some places, but a lot of it's kind of like a donut almost at this point. And we do, the Southwest Corridor design options actually reach out to Tigard and Tualatin where there are some concentrations of communities of color that could really be well served by having better access to some of the education and jobs that are in the uncolored areas. So this is just one way to think about it. This is part of what we'll be doing as we keep moving forward. So I want to now, sorry, you look like you need to.
No, that's a very interesting map.
There are a lot
And
of
this
really
whole
interesting
donut
maps.
thing,
I would
that's
encourage you
really-
to
it
go.
would be- We could spend a lot of time talking about the
Could.
donut, and I'm not going to get into it.
So as I said, the high capacity transit recommendation is from Portland to Tualatin via Tigard, serving the Tigard Triangle and the Tigard downtown. And so this is what we started from last July. There were some options that were removed, and I think it's really important to remember what those options that were removed are. High-capacity transit to Sherwood was taken off of the table. Sherwood's land use vision really didn't support high-capacity transit. What they really wanted was improved local service. We took high-capacity transit or HOV lanes on I-5 off the table. It didn't serve that land use vision. Streetcar is really, we determined to be better suited to be an urban circulator rather than going long distances. High-capacity transit on 99W south of I-5 was taken off of the table by the steering committee actually in 2012. This was one of the things that was talked about a lot in the discussion about the Tigard vote. It was a misconception out there. And then improvements on for the west service is a really important thing that should be looked at, but we determined it's really not part of the Southwest Corridor Plan. It's serving a completely different market, and it should be a separate corridor study later on. So when you look at that, what we're looking at, when you start to get down to the ground and you start to try and design actual light rail or bus rapid transit, which is what we're looking at, both modes, and for bus rapid transit, the steering committee recommendation was that at least 50% of that should be in a dedicated transit way so that it really is bus rapid transit. It really could potentially support the land use, and it would also potentially qualify for New Starts funding. So we're aiming to be able to qualify for some federal funding of this project, assuming that we get to the point of building it. So we're looking at this whole area. That turns into about 50 design options, a little bit over 50 design options when you actually start looking at them. So that's what we're looking at right now. Yesterday, the steering committee actually, as you begin designing this, and this is the TriMet design team who's doing this work, as you begin to actually try and look at the road and think about how you would put light rail or a dedicated transit way, bus rapid transit in to serve these places, we can identify some critical design flaws in some places right away. We also have been hearing from the public about some of these options that we needed to document. We're going into a National Environmental Policy Act process. We want to be sure that we've thoroughly documented any option that we want to take off the table. So, for example, the Haynes Street design option, some of you might have heard about. We had the neighbors from Haynes Street. It's right south of PCC. It was a silly design option in the first place, but we needed to study it. We needed to actually be able to document the reasons why it would really not work. It would totally, it would go through a park. It would go down a very narrow street. It wouldn't really serve the purpose. So yesterday, the steering committee removed 14 design options that were kind of like that. They're kind of the low-hanging fruit. So we don't have 56 to look at anymore. But we might have 45 because through the public engagement process, we've had a few that have been added on and they're not on that map. But it's really important that we do this now because the fewer design options that we have going into an environmental impact statement, the more conservative we can be with our resources. We can do a certain level of analysis now. We'll have to do more analysis when we get into the federal process. So that's where we are right now. I wanted to talk a little bit about outreach. We've been engaging people through a number of different forums, trying to tailor the appropriate tools for the right audience. We're constantly trying to do better in terms of how we engage the public in understanding what we're doing and giving us feedback on what we're doing. So community planning forums are where we invite people from across the corridor, and we had one, we've had 3 so far this year. We'll have another this Thursday night in Tualatin, and we'll have another one in May. We held 3 corridor design workshops last month where we had one in each city, and we focused on the design options in each city. We've been engaging with the private sector and institutions in both, individual stakeholder meetings and also through a group that we formed called ID Southwest, which is focused on implementation of early opportunity projects. We've been to neighborhood groups, and we're continuing to go when it seems like it's the right time and we're requested to visit neighborhood groups. Online engagement is frankly how we've been reaching the most people because we can get at a different audience that way. We've also been working to engage with disadvantaged populations. We've had some special meetings where in each of the communities where we're trying to meet with the leaders to see the best way to engage with folks. And then we had a transit fair with TriMet at St. Anthony's Church where we are trying to, in Tigard, where we're trying to reach Vietnamese and Spanish speakers who tend to go to that church. So we're trying to reach out in different ways in that regard, and also going to city councils, planning commissions like this. So we'll be constantly evolving our approach to engagement to try and take advantage of the best tools that are out there. And our calendar, we'll have a community planning forum this Thursday evening where we're really focusing on the station areas and learning from the public about the opportunities that they see at the different station areas to help, because some of those design options, you're not going to serve the same station with different design options. And we would like to end up with, significantly fewer than 40 design options moving into an EIS. In May, we'll have a community planning forum that we'll have a chance to review a draft steering committee recommendation on what to study further. And we'll also have an online survey. And then we're aiming towards a June 9th steering committee recommendation on what package of HCT design options, multimodal projects, and potential station locations should be in a draft environmental impact statement scope. And then we're looking for the Metro Council to move us forward into that in late June. So this doesn't end there. Denver felt like it was really important to give you the big picture. A number of you have been engaged in these kinds of processes before, so you understand it takes a long time. You can't read that terrifically well, but the time frame that I'm focusing on right now gets us to the first circle up there that says locally preferred alternative, which is we're aiming towards spring of 2016 to get there. So we're really in the pre-work now. Well, it seems like we've done a lot of work. We're in the pre-work, and all of this will get us moving in a more cost-effective and more competitive fashion when we get to the point of looking to ask the federal government to help fund a portion of this project. So I think, is that the end? I think, yes, that's the end. So with that, I think we're happy to answer questions that you guys might have.
Questions, comments? Don?
Just a quick clarification. You mentioned regarding New Start's funding that certain types of transit improvements qualify for that and some don't. Can you draw that line for me again? You kind of went through it quickly.
For bus rapid transit,
Yeah.
it needs to be at least 50% of the alignment needs to be in a dedicated
In its own dedicated
right-of-way.
route.
Yes.
Okay, great.
So that as we design options, that's what we're looking at. We have, for example, one of those permutations of bus rapid transit that's about the most, I don't know, it would be a good one, would be about 78% dedicated right-of-way. So one of the benefits of bus rapid transit is that if it's really difficult to get through a place in its own way, you can go into mixed traffic, but that's also a downfall because then you're stuck in that mixed traffic. So you really have to weigh those choices, and we'll have to do that even further moving forward.
I'm glad there's a flexibility, that degree of flexibility, and you can still qualify for the funding, because the geography is certainly varied out here. And, it's going to require a whole package of improvements and design types to create an effective system. Thanks.
Mike?
Yeah, I was pleased to hear about the green projects. You won't be surprised to hear that. Are those being tied to, one of the biggest contributors to stormwater runoff is the transportation system? Is that part of the thinking, is that it's to some extent mitigation for either past or more imperviousness associated with this project, or is there a nexus there?
There's a nexus. That's not the reason that we did it. We've been very careful not to talk about these as a bank of mitigation projects because we really want to think of them as opportunities, and we
Right.
should do some of them regardless and so, but it's an opportunity to start out with some projects that everybody they've already been vetted, they've already been identified as priorities, as potential mitigation and also as potential catalysts in some station areas for making those places be the kinds of places that are envisioned.
So you're talking about leveraging as well.
Yeah.
Something that did not come up in the climate smart communities, either the written materials or the two meetings we had recently. In fact, adaptation is not on the table yet, so that's my rant. But, the Metro's looking at greenhouse gas reduction. There's another angle on that, and I'm wondering if those green projects could be, certainly it should be explicitly referenced in the green projects as carbon sequestration. So you're cutting down on greenhouse gases, but you can also sequester greenhouse gases. And I'm just wondering if that is even being discussed as part of the green strategies.
Well, don't these systems?
It's a great idea.
Don't these
Pardon?
systems reduce trips? Vehicle
Well, yeah,
trips?
that's
And they reduce the need to widen roads.
That's the greenhouse gas reduction side. I'm
Yeah.
saying that there's another angle on this, which is those trees and the vegetation sucking up CO2 as
Yeah,
well.
okay.
And sequestering it.
Good.
Osmosis.
I get it. Thanks.
I remember that.
Could you go back to the potential alignments map and just share for us what station areas are under consideration for inside the city limits?
Yes. We don't have I wonder, can I zoom?
There's dots.
This might be better.
So tell us what those dots
There's
represent.
dots on.
I wish we could zoom in, but so that's a really important point that you're bringing up, because what Denver showed on the Barber concept plan were only potential stations that are along Barber, and we're clearly looking at more than just Barber, and that's because we're looking at a high capacity transit investment, and we need to be sure that we're looking at all of those potential places that would need, that could benefit from that kind of service. So there's also OHSU up there, up on the hill. That's a potential station. There's Hillsdale, Multnomah Village. None of those were on the Barber concept plan map that Denver showed you. And then PCC, Sylvania, is another one that's not, it's really hard to tell from this map. So it's important to understand that those are part of it. The rest of, and then there's a design option that would look at South Waterfront, and that's not on the Barber concept plan either.
So what are the ways you're considering reaching OHSU at this point?
Well, up on the hill, there are really two ways. One is with a tunnel, and we're looking at 3 tunnels. One that would be a short tunnel, one that would be longer and would serve Hillsdale, and one that would get to Multnomah Village and come out of the Barber Transit Center. We will have a lot of information to support decision-making in terms of whether or not we continue to study all of those tunnels in an environmental impact statement, but that's what we have on the table right now. So that's one way to serve OHSU up on the hill. And then another way that we're looking at is a better pedestrian connection from Barber or NATO, and either a connection to the tram. We've heard that the tram does not potentially have the capacity to be able to serve a lot more riders in the future. So still, that would be a potential connection down to the tram or a better pedestrian connection that would go up from Barber, or you could either access from a Barber station or a NATO station up.
Could that include
People
something?
walk now, but
Yeah.
it's not really very accessible.
Could that include something like a funicular or?
It could.
Okay, and just to clarify the point on the tram, the original point of the tram was to basically enable the inter-campus connection between the two OHSU campuses. It, of course, gets used as a commuter connection because it's convenient. It's that commuter connection that's not really the core purpose that's getting maxed out, right? So
Right.
it's not necessarily, if you work up on top of the hill, the tram is not necessarily going to be your way to get there in the morning much longer because it will just max out.
Yeah, it was never intended for that broader
Right.
context.
Right.
And I know a lot of people in the Multnomah Village that are bicyclists that take the tram home. So you
Sure.
can get up the hill and then.
Right.
Cut out the,
Downhill
cut
both
out the
ways.
elevation.
Yeah, it's a good program.
Why wouldn't you?
Yeah, it's a good program.
I think we ought to just
You don't
tunnel
burn as
under
many
the,
calories.
tunnel under the medical school and reduce it down to sea level. We really, it's a
Okay.
long-term plan.
Okay.
Other questions? I just got to say this, I was not a huge fan of this thing and testified at council, talked about the future asks that PBOT would have, and was told by Commissioner Fritz that never would ask for money. That happened. So that train has left, and I've been run over by the bus. So I've dusted
Very, very rapidly.
very rapidly too.
appropriate hearing.
But I'm back. I guess 2 points. I'm really encouraged by the fact that you've included equity and have that as a criteria. That said, now I'm looking for the EIS, and as you go through the DIS, to have a very, very robust Title VI in environmental justice that actually comes out with some actionable and inclusive items to address the communities that you showed that this connects to outside the donut. And so without that, I get to this project still looks like a silo not connecting to the issues of equity. And it still has a broader context that I'll leave alone. But this is really, if you're going to talk equity, then you got to take some action against it. And so the connections of how you connect to those communities and the housing and those as part of the environmental impact statement need to be truly actionable and doable. And they need to be part of the Portland plan, which would make them actionable and doable. I'll leave it at that.
One last comment from me, and this is one of the reasons I kind of asked the Taggart question. I think that this project's really important, and I think, even as I think of it in increments, even if you took some areas out in the outer part of the donut and put some of these improvements in place, it'd be great improvement.
Oh, there's no question.
It would be, from a lot of perspectives, from a land use perspective and congestion, transportation, environmental. You don't have to fund the whole thing. I think it's a program that could happen in pieces and be very effective going forward.
Yeah, I mean, in a silo, this project makes sense. My issue initially was, if you look at Portland, this competes against East County. It competes against a lot of things, against the regional transportation plan funding. And so
Yeah, I agree.
this has a trifecta of supporters. It has TriMet, ODOT, Metro. I mean, look at the list. There's probably not another project on the RTP that has probably that many jurisdictions all saying yes at the same time. I mean, it's hard to get that many people together saying yes and willing to contribute money, as Chris pointed out. So
I think there's a real pragmatic side
Yeah.
to this. It's not
Yeah.
just aspirational. And I
Yeah.
think it can address a lot of equity concerns and land use concerns as well as transportation.
yeah, I agree. I agree. Mike, did you have something to say?
No, I'll talk to you afterwards.
Oh, okay.
Maybe I will too. Maybe I
Another
will
bus,
too.
a rapid transit bus?
I just want to kind of draw the two together. I agreed with Andre. I was ambivalent about this being priority, but I like your comment. It will be looked through through the lens of the Portland plan, ultimately, as we judge it, won't it? So is it a priority in the Portland plan? And if it does it meet the criteria of what we're looking for in equity and diversity? So I think we have a lot of ways to comment, and I think we have a lot of ways to, in our own way, when we bring it forward, prioritize it. So it's a good and a worthy goal, and I think it really does bring a part of the city into public transport that needs to happen, really needs to happen.
Any other comments? Thank you, Howard. Good comment, Don. I appreciate what you're saying.
This
And
is cool.
no, I do.
We gotta go do it.
Anything else? Huh? Well, thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you. And with that, I think we're adjourned.